Are you ready to rewind? Take a nostalgia-filled ride back to a simpler time. It's Acid Wash Memories, a retro pop culture celebration. And now your hosts, Joe Murata and Michael Quinn.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 15 of Acid Wash Memories, a retro pop culture celebration. And today it's all about the 16-bit console wars. I am Joe Murata, joined, of course, by Michael Quinn. How you doing there, Michael?
Howdy console
there.
time.
Console time and
video games.
I hope this is a consolation to all of you out there.
Yeah.
Starting off your week, we hope you enjoy this episode. We're diving into the big two of the video game wars of the 90s, and we'll get to that in just one second here. I'm excited about this one. This is the first, Quinn, truly video game related episode that we've done.
Video game centric.
Very
episode.
centric, yes. We hope you enjoy this. If this happens to be your first time, we have 14 other episodes available in our archives. You can pick a topic and listen to it. Mm-hmm. We appreciate all the positive feedback from the Wonder Years episode from last
wonderful.
week. It was, Michael. We had a lot of fun doing that, but as we always say, something completely different this week, and we're talking about video games. Before we get to that, I want to remind you to follow us on Twitter, if you have a Twitter, at AWM Podcast. You can just follow us there, get updates on the show and some videos and things. And you can also, if you want to join in on the discussion with several hundred other pop culture minded retro fanatics,
yes,
you can go to our Acid Wash Memories group on Facebook. It's free. We will let you in, and there is, to the best of my knowledge, Quinn, zero drama over there.
None of it. We don't do that.
We don't do that.
Yeah.
We're just having fun and reminiscing and things. So thank you so much for being with us here on Acid Wash Memories. Quinn, as anyone that grew up or was even on the periphery of growing up in the 90s could tell you.
If you were a kid.
If you were a kid, maybe a young adult even.
Yeah.
If you were coming of age, so to speak, and you remember the 90s, when it came to the video games, there were two big players for the first half of the 90s especially. Yes. And we're talking about the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo. And these two consoles waged the 16-bit war in the video game battlefield, Michael.
Quite a war, a digital battlefield, if you will.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, there was a lot of analog, too. But
a lot of bits also.
Yeah, it's some bits, 16 of them. And I feel like it was like a milestone thing or something. And it felt so important, even though it's like two plastic boxes competing for people to buy them, right? But
essentially,
before a time where people had all the consoles, like that was like a normal thing people did. It was like you either had this one or you had that one.
Generally.
And there was no like
unless
in between.
You had a lot of money.
Because this was kind of like the second major video game generation, right?
Yes.
So people before were only kind of accustomed to having maybe like before that an Atari or like a Nintendo, but it wasn't like you had both.
Correct.
You know,
it was rare.
So people went into this, and this was the first time it felt like there was truly one-on-one competition. There wasn't like somebody just dominating, right?
Correct.
Hey, guy, you're the first serious gamer I've seen all morning. Check this out. Brand new 16-bit Super Nintendo with Super Mario World. Wow!
What's this one?
Oh, this is Sonic the Hedgehog from Sega Genesis.
As we've done in our Wars series here, we've done things about burgers and we've done things about Coca-Cola versus Pepsi. Really, ultimately, it's going to come down to what you, the consumer, prefer.
Right.
You have the hard facts, and we're going to tell you some of the hard facts in terms of what sold more and what had better technical specs and all these things. Mm-hmm. But really, when it comes to the brand loyalty aspect, a lot of it comes down to who falls into the marketing, who falls into the demographic.
Right. Also, I think age group has a lot to do with
the demo.
When you were around when each of them debuted.
Absolutely. And I think we're going to be exploring that because they were used to their advantage, those particular demographics in the marketing campaigns throughout these systems. So we're obviously looking for you to tell us, hey, did you like Super Nintendo more? Did you like Genesis more? Or were you indifferent?
Yes.
Because some people were. Just to set our background here, I am going to remain as impartial as possible, as I always try to do on these things. I did have a Super Nintendo growing up, however.
I did as well. I would later get a Genesis, but much after the war was settled.
Right.
For exploratory purposes, because I just like video games.
For research, obviously, for research purposes.
For your health.
My brother, who I didn't live with, it's a long story. You don't need to hear my family history. But my older brother, who was 5.5, almost 6 years older than me, he had both a Super Nintendo and then a little bit later a Genesis.
Wow.
So I played my fair share. No. I don't know how he pulled that one off. But I played my fair share of Genesis, both when it was actually in console form and later on in my emulation days.
Right. Emulation was when I think we all got to get our taste of both. And kind of come to our final decisions as consumers and video gamers, if you will.
And I'm here to tell you that I think they're both great. I think they both have their merits. I think they both have excellent games, that some games are better on one console versus another, and some have unique games that are only on one.
That's true.
So I'm not, I don't know if you know this, Quinn, but there are people out there that get very territorial about their brand loyalty.
I mean, we all got our favorites, right?
And that's fine. I'm here to say I think they're both great. Whichever one you like more, you like more. But Quinn, to even get, of course, to the 16-bit war, we have to roll it all the way back. Quinn, what is a game?
A game is a contest in which two sides compete. There's usually a set of rules to the game, because what are you doing if there's no rules, right?
Like polo is a game.
Put a ball in a cup, throw this in a hoop, Like, there's always, and how many times you can do it, and there's a score, and generally, right? But then, some very smart guys, they figured out, we can take the games and put them on the TV.
The TV.
The TV, right?
Yes.
They figured it all out. All of a sudden, in the 70s and maybe late 60s even, computers started coming around.
Yep.
And somebody figured out that if I have this dot, I can make another little dot come out of it, and I can shoot at another big dot, and then it blows up. And then you had Space War, the first video game ever in MIT or wherever the hell it was.
A student by the name of Steve Russell started work on a computer program that was revolutionary for its time. What he ended up creating was a video game called Space War.
Now, we hope you were able to follow those very highly technical terms, big dot, little dot. It's hard, but we're here to walk you through it, folks. The first generation of video game consoles is generally agreed to be launched in 1972, and they were still in circulation up to the early 80s, more on 1983 and video games later. But to just briefly run down the first two generations, the Magnavox Odyssey series was actually pretty much considered to be the first home console of any kind.
This is in a day of really all they had was arcades, or you had to go to, like I said, some kind of college that had a computer at it.
Yeah. The computer.
And the kind of computer that had a screen. Even that was fucking rare.
Right, that was huge back then.
You know what I mean?
Screen optional.
So Max Baer, I think it was, he devised a way to put it in the home, in a little, a circuit board in a box.
Pretty much.
That hooked to a TV. Now, you know what I think is interesting about the Magnavox Odyssey?
Go ahead.
Is that the graphics were so primitive, because, this was really we're trying to get first to market here. Let's just do something, right?
We're talking Sanford & Son is a new show.
Right. And we're talking ultimately all we have is just dots.
Yeah,
we
literally.
only have dots.
This is really rudimentary.
So the thing came with, I think it was 8 or something programmed games into the thing. And basically, there was things you put on top of the screen. Overlays that if it's game 7, put this one on it. Those were the graphics, and the dots would play into the overlays.
Exactly.
Right?
So really, the dots were just the dots.
Right.
A lot of dots on this episode. And we're going to connect them all for you in a second.
Only black and white. You had white or black, and that's all you could write to the screen.
Back in my day, we didn't even have color back in the 70s.
Odyssey easily attaches to any brand TV, black and white or color, to create a closed-circuit electronic playground.
But Atari's Pong was a huge one in the first gen. That was 1975. Now, Pong is essentially tennis, table tennis, ping pong.
Atari, inventors of electronic games, put the quarters in, just made Pong for home TVs.
And the Pong home consoles were a huge deal in the mid-70s.
Yes, Pong in general was a huge deal. The first one was so successful that the first time it broke was not because the video game broke. It was the coins got stuck up the machine.
Right.
They came out to repair it, and they're like, "Oh my god!"
Constipation.
I've seen documentaries on this, and the realization, because they put it in a bar somewhere, and they didn't think
it would catch on
they
this.
thought, maybe a lot of people, maybe some people will play it. It'll take a while, but word of mouth, right? But then within a week, the machine was broken because there was too many coins.
And that is one of the big reasons why Atari became such a huge player for the first 10 or so years of video games in general.
So they went into the home.
Yeah, and they went into the home. You had Pong home consoles, and Coleco had the Telstar system from 1976 to 1978.
You're watching the most exciting game you will ever see on your TV set. Telstar by Coleco.
Other than that, though, the first generation of video game consoles, outside of the hardcore enthusiasts, it's not widely remembered. There's not a lot of nostalgia for outside of Pong.
Yeah, it's mostly a burgeoning arcade business and experimenting and let's see what works.
See
right?
what sticks.
They would just try anything back then.
Exactly, as we've talked about on the show.
Yeah, they just didn't fucking know.
They didn't know yet.
Yeah,
it's like the Windows 1.0, basically.
Yeah,
if you want to equate it to
yeah.
software. Now, the second generation of video game consoles began, again, agreed upon around 1976 with several home consoles, such as the Fairchild Channel F, the Intellivision by Mattel, which was a big player.
Yeah, definitely.
Discover Intellivision. It can change your family's life.
This is kind of like the first console war, I want to say.
Yeah, because you had Mattel's Intellivision, Magnavox Odyssey 2, which came out in 79, and Intellivision was 80. You had the ColecoVision in 1982.
Right.
Another big one.
Introducing ColecoVision, the most advanced video game system you can buy. It plays just like the arcade game.
You had the Vectrex in 82, but the one that came first,
the big boy,
Atari 2600 in 1977.
Attention, shoppers. The new Atari cartridge game is in.
Excuse me.
Uh-oh. George again.
Ooh, Atari's ASCII battle.
It comes with 27 games, but that's just for starters.
I mean, this one was so successful. I mean, it's probably one of the longest lasting consoles just because it was like ubiquitous, like you like to say, right? I mean, everyone had one of these things, right?
Everyone had one.
Little like brown wooden box with a board in it, and
cartridges,
and it had little levers on it with different modes and the joystick.
Yep.
And all that.
And we look back on it now, and obviously, even when Quinn and I were kids, this was around, but not
I had
popular.
one, so it was like a hand-me-down,
right.
So like an uncle gave me or something.
Yeah,
right?
because it was of your uncle's generation, where people were caring about that. Was it the uncle I'm thinking of? Your mom's brother?
No, the other,
different one,
a different uncle,
random uncle.
Yeah.
Anyway, random uncles notwithstanding, the Atari 2600. I don't know if it is groundbreaking too big a word, Quinn, or is that about accurate?
Earth-shattering, probably.
Yeah, okay.
I mean,
so
this is
small a word.
I think that this piece of machinery here is probably where video game consoles, as we know it, come from. A cartridge. So
Fair.
Tons of games.
Fair.
A joystick. All the basics, right?
Attempts at graphical representations of what you're doing.
Right. Actual games that represented things people could understand on the screen. Not like there was still a lot of abstract stuff going on, but for the most part, like Pitfall, a little guy and he jumps over a pit.
Yes, of course.
Like Space Invaders and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And
Donkey Kong.
Which
was
all
a huge
sorts of
game.
revolutionary things. Adventure. Basically Zelda before Zelda. Mm-hmm. I mean, it really is.
Like an overmap and all that.
I recently tried it. They released an Atari 50th anniversary collection.
They did?
With documentary footage that would accompany each game.
Well, that's cool.
And it was really super cool because they were explaining how they made Adventure, and it was crazy when you get to finally try it at the end of the documentary. And you play it, and you're like, "Holy shit, this is just Zelda." It's not even that far off.
Right.
Again, it's just a dot, but the dot's doing all the things Link does.
Sure. Right, I gotcha. Now, Atari did release in the second generation in 1982 the successor to the 2600, the 5200. And without spending a lot of time on that, can we just agree that it was not nearly as successful?
It's kind of a piece of crap.
It was kind of a flop, yeah.
Yeah.
This summer, the really hot video games come from Atari. We've got Centipede, Ms. Pac-Man, Vanguard, and Galaxian.
But that wouldn't be the end of Atari, and we'll get more back to them later. However, something happened in 1983. Two big things in 1983 in video games. Actually, maybe even three. One of the things that happened is the dawning of the third generation, commonly known as the 8-bit era.
Right.
And the 8-bit era was kicked off with a company named Nintendo of Japan and their Famicom, short for its family computer. Now, what the hell is Nintendo? Here's a brief history for you, and one day we'll have a whole separate Nintendo-centric episode.
The Nintendo episode, yeah.
But this is just a rundown. So Nintendo, the company, some people know this, actually began life in 1889.
Yeah.
Yes.
Their history is like, it's insane to me that they're like
so
from
long.
the 1800s.
Yes. Yeah. And this is an abridged version, but they were known as Nintendo Karuta, and it was founded by Fusahiro Yamauchi. They were a playing card company.
Yes.
There was a Japanese playing card called Hanafuda.
Yes.
And basically this was
they had like the picture of Napoleon on it, the famous... Somebody recently...
Who was contemporary.
Yeah, somebody recently like freaking found one of those. Like somebody's grandparent, hey, my grandfather gave this to me. Like I saw it on Twitter now, and like somebody like posted on Twitter like, holy shit. Like what?
So anyway, Nintendo is a playing card manufacturer and distributor, and in 1929, Yamauchi retired, and his successor was Sekiro Kaneda, and he had a joint venture with another company, and it became Yamauchi Nintendo & Co. Okay? Stick with me. By 1947, he also founded a distribution company named Marufuku Co. Yes,
okay,
I'm not cursing at you. This was renamed to Nintendo Karuta in 1950. In 1958, now we're post-war, a deal with Disney, the Disney.
Yeah, the.
You heard of Walt?
Yeah, them.
Him. Remember them?
Disney Plus fame.
Yeah, remember? You ever heard of Disney Plus? You ever heard of Mickey Mouse?
Yeah.
That company. A deal was made with Nintendo and Disney to put their characters on their cards, and it was successful, and in 1962, Nintendo went public, and by 1963, they were known simply as Nintendo, and in fact, off the boon of all this success, they started doing other things like marketing instant noodles and vacuums and weird products.
The Japanese way, if you will.
Just whatever
I feel like you
can
find
sell.
all these electronics companies, if you look at the history of a lot of them, they're all like involved in other fucking shit.
All sorts of shit.
Like all of them are.
I mean, even like Yamaha still is like, hey, we make guitars and motorcycles.
For reasons.
Right,
like,
exactly. By 1966, the playing card industry kind of stunk, to put it nicely. So Nintendo decided, well, why don't we just enter the toy industry like Bandai and some of these other companies? In 1972, Nintendo manufactured a light gun accessory for the Magnavox Odyssey.
Of course they did.
Of course they did. So now they're into the video game.
They're very like toy based in the 70s. They have that like weird like gun that shoots a fist.
Yeah,
like all that bullshit.
That's true.
Yeah.
I think that's a late 60s, early 70s thing. And Nintendo eventually made its own arcade game, starting with a game in 1975 known as EVR Race, and eventually hit it big as an arcade game manufacturer and developer with Donkey Kong in 1981. Yes.
It's Donkey Kong, the arcade sensation.
So this was Nintendo's big hit.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, Donkey Kong was a massive hit in the the golden period of arcades, like when Atari was running wild.
Absolutely.
And, like, Nintendo was right there with them, right?
As a manufacturer.
Right, yeah.
Donkey Kong introduced us to a character known as Jumpman, who would, of course, later be known as Mario.
It's me, Mario.
Yes.
Super Mario. You might have heard. They have a movie out.
Super Mario?
He has a new movie.
Yes, him.
So that's Nintendo. But another console was released by a totally different company, a company named Sega, in Japan only in 1983, released the SG-1000, which eventually had an upgrade and was known as the Mark II in 1984.
Yes, the Mark. These weird, like, Sega before Genesis stuff is just, other than the Master System's like their true final form of their 8-bit consoles.
It is.
Yeah.
And the Mark III was released in 1985. It would be ported over to the United States as the Master System, but first, what the hell is Sega?
I don't know!
Well, Sega was founded in 1940 as Standard Games by a fellow named Irving Bromberg.
Very standard.
Extremely standard. Not just average games.
Yes.
His son, Marty, remember Marty Bromberg?
Yeah.
Of course.
Him.
And a friend of theirs named James Humpert. And this was founded, of course, in Honolulu, because that's what I expected.
Right.
And by May of 1945... This is war, not even post-war, just war.
The war.
California Games became their name, and they dissolved Standard Games. In 1946, though, they dissolved Standard Games and started a company known as Service Games. And they were, at this time, an importer and a restorer of slot machines at the time for the military and then on a consumer level.
So Sega's kind of like, we're talking about real roots of the arcade here.
Very rudimentary.
The roots, like slot machines and stuff like that. Yeah.
And then they started providing them to Japan in 1953 and became known as Service Games of Japan. And they also had an out branch known as Service Games of Panama. Of course they did. Panama. Now, they did have some issues with tax evasion and bribery around the turn of the decade, 1959, 1960. And
weird time for that to happen.
A very odd time during the end of the Eisenhower administration, I guess. And by May 31st, 1960, Service Games of Japan was dissolved. However, only days later, Quinn, on June 3rd, there were two new companies, Kakai Seizo, and I'm probably butchering these pronunciations. I'm sorry, I am not Japanese. I don't know how to speak the language or pronounce it, which was doing business as Sega Incorporated.
We know that.
Service Games, the SE from Service.
And that's also a very Japanese thing to like abbreviate something and like make a word out of it.
Yes.
Like it's like, okay, it's Sega.
It's just
now.
Sega. So they were the slot machine manufacturer, and there was another company known as Goraku Busan, which was doing business as Utamatic, and that was the distributor of the said slot machines. These companies purchased Service Games of Japan's assets, and everything all merged together in 1964, and thus we had Sega Enterprises. And there became a shift from slot machines to coin-operated machines that you would find in the arcade. Notably, Gulf and Western bought them in 1969.
Nice.
And they became an arcade game developer in the 70s. And their big killer app, you might have heard of it, developed with Konami, Frogger, in 1981.
Hey, Jerry, remember Frogger? I used to be so into this game.
I mean, Sega... And that's just the beginning. I mean, Sega, from that point forward, would be like an arcade-like machine.
Yeah.
You know, we're talking about Hang On and...
Outrun.
Yeah.
A lot of games.
Lots of games, like Wonder Boy. Like, that was in the arcades,
Wonder
too.
Boy
like,
was good.
Yeah, like tons of just arcade games, right?
Absolutely.
Like classic, like real classic arcade games of the late 70s, early 80s.
Yep.
I mean, they were there, right?
Mm-hmm. Now, we mentioned that the Famicom came out in 1983, an 8-bit home console, and Sega's SG-1000 came out in 1983. But also in 1983, on our side of things here in the United States, there was, of course, the great video game crash.
Thanks, Atari.
Thank you, Atari, and E.T.
Yeah.
Now, we did talk about this in some episode a few weeks, months back.
I mean, we should retread because this is where it actually matters because it's what sets the stage for all this shit.
Yes. So, I mean... There are various factors. It's not simply too many E.T. games that were made.
E.T. is like the kind of like...
It's the scapegoat,
It's
Quinn.
the scapegoat because it's like it's kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, right?
I think that's a better way to put it.
Basically, like Atari had no quality controls. Anybody can make a fucking Atari game, right?
Yes, and they
so
did.
like Kellogg's Golden Crisp Atari game. Like it does
porn.
Like porn.
Hugh
whatever.
Hefner's Atari.
Hugh Hefner's Playboy Bunny's Playmates Atari game, right?
Look at these dots.
It doesn't matter. It's like Mr. Boat's Atari game.
Yeah, Mr. Bean's Atari game.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. Anybody could do it. Joe and Quinn's Atari game.
Can someone? But outside of Atari, it was overall a flooded market between Coleco, like we talked about, and Mattel's and Television and the Odyssey 2.
Right. So when everybody can just make whatever they want on like this home console, you start to get weird shit. And then people are like, is this even good?
Right.
Like, you know, like, and there's no way for people to know.
Right.
And then finally, like, this game came along that was promised to be good because Steven Spielberg is bringing his E.T. to Atari this Christmas. Yeah, like, it's going to be so fucking good.
The video game that lets you help E.T. get home just in time for Christmas.
And so kids get this shit on Christmas, and they're like, Dad, like people are like, what the fuck? Like you're like falling in holes and you don't know what's going. Like you fall in the hole and then you're stuck in it and you don't know what to do. And some people just like never played it again. Like it just was confusing.
And
it was programmed in like a week or something.
It was a rush job. It was sloppy and rather infamously, and it was proven to be true several years back. There was always this long-standing rumor that thousands of them were buried. You know, unsold, unopened cartridges were buried.
Some of them returned too.
Or returns were buried in a New Mexico landfill. And yes, it actually is true.
It's real. They
it
found
actually
like
is true.
Thousands of them in a landfill.
E.T. is definitely here. The legend was so awesome. Like, it's kind of a shame to finally figure it out, right? Like, I think it was almost better to be the legend of what it was.
Another thing that's interesting, though, too, that contributed to the video game crash, and what we mean by that is people stopped buying them at the level that they had been. That's what we mean by crash.
Because there was a confidence that was just gone by consumers.
Yeah,
they were
consumer confidence.
We don't know if this is good.
Right.
And we don't even know if this is a fad or something. Like, nobody's going to care about this shit, so why should we keep buying the games?
And stigmas sometimes have a tendency to spread like wildfire.
And they did.
And they did in this case. But there was also the competition from home computers around the same time. And that was another contributing factor because those had a better reputation.
There was an idea that it's like, well, why do I even need Atari when my home computer can play the games that my kid wants to play?
Exactly.
Right? You know, and I can work on it also.
Yes, that's the other thing. It's multifaceted. The biggest dip for the industry was 84 and especially 1985, which is one of the reasons why both Nintendo and Sega decided to hold off on porting their systems over to the US.
Yes, that's the interesting part, is that the Famicom and the Mark III, they were rocking and rolling for like 2 years in Japan. There was like a ton of games. The US release prompted a bunch of other big titles.
Higher profile titles.
But you had all the Nintendo like black box games that everyone knows, you know.
Ice hockey.
Ice Climber.
Ice Climber.
Yeah.
Baseball.
Like
all
the
those
like
originals.
basic ass shit. The point is that there was like a ton of these kind of basic games, but they were well-made games. That was the thing with the early Nintendo games, is there was actual quality, and that's what Nintendo brought to the game. Is Nintendo saw what happened to Atari.
Yes.
And if you ever noticed on a Nintendo game when you bought it, there was this Nintendo seal of quality, right?
Which means they paid us money.
Well, which means
so
is that somebody that Nintendo had to review the game before it was put on the fucking system.
They did, and by having people pay to submit the game to them to put the label on, that at least incentivized the game to be good.
Yeah, Nintendo was like, also Nintendo owned like the cartridges, so you had to pay Nintendo to print the game.
Correct.
On top. Like
their business model was brilliant.
They controlled the whole flow.
Yes.
So that they controlled what got put on the system.
And to some would say to a dictatorial extent.
It got out of control later, but in 1983, this was absolutely fucking needed. Right? Because
100%.
This is what stopped porn and fucking Billy's shootout that nobody's ever heard of, and what the fuck is that? Like, right?
Exactly. And one of the things that Nintendo did in 1985, once the market started to at least level off and not dip, is they reintroduced the family computer, the Famicom, to the United States market in the fall of 85 as the Nintendo Entertainment System. And one of the things they did, Quinn, that I find genius from a marketing perspective is they completely changed the look of the system.
Right. So there's reasons behind this.
Yes, there are.
So video games, still by 85, there was a stigma. It's like, that's a fad. Who fucking wants that shit, right?
That's a toy.
What do? The NES has that gray, like every other fucking PC on the market at the time, look to it, right?
Utilitarian look.
Utilitarian, right? On top of it, it comes with this robot Rob who's kind of fucking useless, but the point was to say it's like, your kids are going to get this big robot.
They also get this,
They get this robot thing with it, and it plugs into the TV and all this bullshit. Those two things together kind of like massage the conditions for this to be like, people were willing to pay money for it.
Will you be the first to get all this in one package? The Nintendo Entertainment System, where video technology is more than a game.
And also the differentiation from a computer, because obviously Famicom, family computer in Japan, this is an entertainment system.
Right. This is for entertainment purposes. This isn't for work.
This doesn't replace your computer. You need a computer and this.
Hell, it comes with a robot toy in it.
Right.
You know what I mean?
It's got also a gun.
Yeah. It has a gun. How are you going to use that for work?
I don't want to know, actually. Yeah. There's a guy that knows a guy that might be able to answer that question. But anyway, the Nintendo Entertainment System, again, this will be a separate episode, so if we're glossing here, let us gloss, was released in the fall of 1985 in the United States. But there were some other things released in the United States right around the same time. In May of 86, when Michael Quinn was born.
Oh, yeah, me.
To celebrate that, Atari, who was still a player here, released the much more successful than its predecessor, 7800.
Yes, this thing.
The Atari 7800, the choice of the experts.
This was their true 8-bit console.
Right.
It was not obviously on the level of the 26.
Yeah.
Clearly.
No.
Nothing they ever did ever was. But the 78 was released to compete with the Nintendo.
But it was too late.
It was too late, and it had the name Atari on it.
Yes. In Nintendo, Nintendo comes to market, right? We have to remember the launch lineup in America. You had Super Mario Brothers.
Super Mario Brothers
like
was the
Duck
killer.
Hunt
Duck Hunt,
and
yeah.
stuff like that. It's like, and it just kept snowballing. By 86, you had Zelda, and Metroid. And
Metroid, yeah.
all of a sudden, Nintendo's got these quality games.
Yeah.
And Atari's just got bullshit, and nobody trusts them.
The one point in the 78's favor is that it was the first backward compatible system. It played 2,600 games, which the 52 didn't do.
Which is,
it had that.
It's a notable feature.
Give it that.
And backwards compatibility is always a plus.
Definitely.
Nobody's ever going to poo-poo that.
Right. Who's going to complain about that?
Right.
And then Sega, as we mentioned, they had the Mark III in 85 in Japan. They released it as the kind of a revamped version as the Sega Master System.
Because everyone doesn't know what happened to Mark II and 1.
Yeah, who's Mark anyway?
Who is Mark? Right, exactly.
Mark?
So they just say, it's something completely different.
And you're the master of this
Yeah.
system. This is for masters, okay?
Now, the Master System, I got to say,
September 86.
From a technical perspective,
it's superior to Nintendo.
It was really good.
It's a great console.
I always think the biggest example of this is stupid, but you ever see the Ghostbusters NES versus the Ghostbusters?
Sure.
It's dramatically better.
Yeah, no, the Master System was a great console.
Right.
Its problem is that it was released a year after Nintendo.
Sega challenges you with the ultimate video game. The Sega Master System, with twice as much memory as any other video game. Advanced video technology like scrolling backgrounds, graphics in 64 colors.
It had no chance.
Matter.
And Nintendo was like, okay, by the as we get further and further along in this 8-bit generation, right? Nintendo's just killing it. They got Mega Man. It just kept getting better and better and better.
They had tons of games.
They just had tons of games.
They had so many games, and I'm not saying all of them were good because they weren't, but they had so many good games.
Right. Punch Out, yeah, in 87, 88 that was released. Yeah.
Mike Tyson's Punch Out.
I mean, the list goes on and on with Nintendo games. Tecmo Bowl. There was just so many smash hits that it kind of it was unbeatable.
Super Mario 2?
Yeah, without going into the nitty-gritties, but Mario 2, Mario 3.
Yeah. Another episode one
Zelda
day.
2, whatever.
Zelda 2 I liked, even though everyone hates.
It kind of stinks.
It does.
But anyway.
I like it anyway.
The point is
Castlevania.
that Castlevania.
And that whole series.
Yeah. The point is Nintendo was just kind of their third-party partners were good.
Yeah.
Their first-party games were excellent.
Yes.
It was just the perfect storm. Nobody was touching them by that point. And I think if I've seen the sales number, I think 87 is the year it just took the fuck off. All of a sudden, it was they were unstoppable.
So in 1987, funny you should mention that, Nintendo dominated with 65% of the home console market. That's huge.
Yeah.
Atari.
From nothing.
Right, from nothing.
They didn't have a console before in America.
Now Atari, and that's every Atari console, the 26, the 52, and the 78, they had 24%, which is a lot of that is
it's
legacy.
Respectable, but it's legacy.
It's legacy from the 26.
Right.
Sega, new to the U.S. market, had 8%.
Right. And that's the thing is from people at the time has told me and, just seeing the sales numbers and everything, it was the Master System was some novelty that nobody had.
Right.
Right. It was
not a lot of people had it.
Yeah, that's all
8%.
it was. Yeah. But I think it laid the groundwork for Sega to say, okay.
We can do consoles.
We know how to do this now. Let's try it again. Right.
To set the stage here, in the late 80s, as we roll towards the 90s, this is the period of time where so many homes had a Nintendo installed in them. So many kids played Nintendo. Mario was becoming, as I would say, ubiquitous, right?
It was on every TV in America, there was just a Nintendo there.
Right. And there are news articles, is your kid playing too much video games? I'm addicted to Nintendo, and all that stuff.
It wasn't even, is your kid playing too much video games? Is your kid playing too much Nintendo?
Watching the kids play, seeing the intensity of their interest, the word obsession comes to mind.
I bet I'm much better than him at Zelda.
How many hours you play a day?
Around 1 or 2.
2 hours a night?
It's a
when
lot.
When you should be doing your homework?
Yeah.
That's the other thing that happened in all of this is they stopped calling them video games and they started calling it Nintendo. That's how big this was.
This
right?
is like, remember when if you're a wrestling fan, you would know that in the mid to late 80s, the WWF became wrestling, right? So it's like, are you watching WWF?
Nobody asked, are you watching wrestling? Or pro wrestling.
Right. And I'm talking about mainstream, not you people that were on Usenet, okay?
Right.
Talking about the mainstream. Same thing with video games. Oh, what are you playing, Nintendo?
Right. Even if it wasn't Nintendo, people thought you were playing Nintendo.
Nintendo became synonymous. Kids grew up, 2-3-year-olds with Nintendos. Maybe their older sibling had it or something.
Right.
They're like, oh, Nintendo, I know what that is.
And even the older sibling doesn't even know of any video games prior to
no one cares.
Nintendo.
And
they're like, they got fucking Mega Man. Who gives a shit?
Right. I'm playing Ninja Gaiden. What do I care?
Exactly.
So Sega, meanwhile, gave their United States distribution to Tonka, the toy company, in 1987.
Weird.
Yes, I know. And I want to mention, to the Master System's credit, it was very successful in Europe. It was actually Europe's best-selling console in 1990.
Yeah, but Europe's also a place where, like, ZX Spectrum is popular.
Z, yes, specifically Z.
Not Z.
Yes. And in Brazil, it achieved huge popularity, distributed by Tectoy. And anyway,
yeah, I'll tell you what. You know, it's funny you say that. Brazil is like a huge Sega market.
It's its own thing
it
over
always
there, man.
was. There was like Genesis games into the fucking 2000s or some shit. Like I remember finding like weird rogue like Brazilian Genesis ROMs like way too late that were like new.
that were new.
Yeah.
And just to button up Master System, the final licensed United States Master System game was in 1991, starring a mascot that we will get to in a little bit. There was a Master System version of this little blue guy.
Yeah.
But we will get to that later. Meanwhile, as we said, the Nintendo was dominating. The Nintendo Entertainment System was dominating into the 90s. However, it was time for a challenge. And of course, when we think of the first big challenger to Nintendo, we obviously think NEC with the PC Engine.
The TurboGrafx 16.
That's correct.
In America.
TurboGrafx 16, the higher energy video game system.
It's 16-bit, but not really.
Well, the deal is it's got dual 16-bit GPUs, which is graphical processors, but the actual CPU is 8-bit.
Right, it's 8-bit, so it's just not as fast. Can't take in as much data as 16-bit if you know anything about computers.
But it visually looks more impressive.
That GPU definitely fucking helps, right?
Absolutely. And it was released as PC Engine in October of 87, by NEC, and they teamed up with Hudson Soft, who was a video game maker as well.
Right.
So in the United States, the PC Engine was revamped as the Graphics 16 because of the bits.
So turbo.
And it was released, believe it or not, very proud of this, on my third birthday, August 29th, 1988. And here's the deal with it. I had a friend who just had to be different, and he had one in 91. I remember playing 92.
No, if you're just coming from Nintendo, this thing looks like
it's fucking awesome.
Looks like it's from fucking space.
Yeah,
like,
no,
you're like,
it was
what
great.
the fuck? The games are on these little fucking credit
They're on
cards.
like the Master System games were.
Yeah, but they made a big deal about it on like Master System. It was like
the Who cards,
Who card, and like that. Oh my god,
there's like a big fuss about it.
Yeah,
right?
It's like look at we're fitting all these 16 bits all over the place, right? It's like look at this shit.
All
right?
these bits on this one little card.
Yeah.
Now their flagship, Nintendo had Mario. Sega at this point had Alex Kidd, which we'll get into later, but they had Bonk.
Yes,
this
Bonk.
Little caveman with a big
Bonk,
head.
from a graphical perspective.
Great games, by the way.
Yeah, great fun games. Yeah,
they really are.
But they look these look just blew Nintendo out of the water with this
Holy shit,
right?
did they? Yes.
So many colors and the levels were so different and dynamic and stuff. It just blew the NES out of the water from a graphical perspective.
It's 10,000 years ago. You're a cave dude. You are carnivorous. You've got to bonk 28 stages of prehistoric bad guys to rescue your excellent-looking princess.
And they had Splatterhouse, which was a controversial but very fun slasher game.
Yeah, bloody.
Loved it.
Yeah, yeah.
I actually played it on the console in the early 90s.
Like, later on when the CD comes along, it's like the best Castlevania game, Rondo of Blood. Like,
PC Engine CD or TurboGrafx, yes. Yeah. The problem was it didn't have anything else really. I mean, it had games, but they didn't capture the imagination or the attention of the audience.
Yeah, it felt like it failed at the beginning, which hindered its growth. And like they made different attempts, like the Super Graphics, which only had 6 games.
Yes,
and they had the fucking CD, and the CD.
No one cared by then.
To be quite honest with you, the CD had a lot of support. There was a lot of shit for it.
It had games.
But again, just nobody cared.
Was buying it.
Yeah,
it was just too much going on.
Well, it's because video games are Nintendo, and that's why, right?
Or Sega.
But,
Maybe.
Yeah, but not even just yet, right? Because the turbos come now. What's Sega's deal here?
Well, here's the deal. Let me button up a PC Engine and TurboGrafx here. It actually did outsell the Famicom in Japan only in 87.
Yeah, but the Famicom was from 1983 in
Correct.
Nintendo.
It was
had
older.
2 extra years.
Yep.
People were like, this has been out forever over there.
The PC Engine and the TurboGrafx did almost nothing in the USA and Europe in terms of market saturation. Nothing. It didn't do anything. And it was discontinued in 1994.
Wow.
I can't believe it went that long, but it did.
They tried.
They did try.
That's the one thing I'll always give NEC credit with the TurboGrafx is they tried.
They did try.
They didn't just let it go after 2 years.
100%. And I will say the Bonk series is very good.
Right.
I'm serious. The Bonk
and Hudson Soft went on to, go over to Super Nintendo and Genesis and all that. They didn't just stop making video games.
And they also did the Adventure Island series, which I love.
I mean, Hudson Soft had Bomberman.
And they had Bomberman.
That was their big claim to fame.
100%. Meanwhile, Sega, we were talking about them, so they have the Master System, but they unveil in Japan the Mega Drive in October of 88. Now, this, Quinn, is
By the way, what a fucking cool name.
Great name.
I actually kind of like it better than Genesis.
Do you?
Yeah. Mega Drive. That just sounds dope.
This is a true 16-bit system.
Right.
This has a Motorola processor on it, the CPU.
It was one of the fastest on the market at the time.
Absolutely was. And it actually had very good, I don't even want to say good, exceptional graphics.
Yes.
It really did.
Very, very good, actually, for the time.
The thing that they were trying to do was say, this is an arcade machine. You're going to get an arcade experience at home.
And we're Sega. We know what the fuck we're talking about.
We made the arcade
games. Look at our arcade games. We make Afterburner and Outrun and shit, right? It's we know what we're talking about.
Altered Beast, those things.
We're just putting that arcade machine in your house. That's kind of what Sega's saying, which it isn't, but
It isn't, but in August of 89, it was released in the United States of America as the Sega Genesis, also a cool name.
Yes.
It is a cool name.
Equally a cool name.
Cool name.
And so it was. He brought forth Genesis, a system with twice the power, twice the intelligence, twice the challenge, twice the fun.
And some of the launch titles for Sega Genesis here in 1980 time would include Ghouls and Ghosts, Super Thunderblade, Space Harrier 2, Tommy Lasorda Baseball, which, hey, a sports game.
Thunder Force is no joke.
Good point.
Yeah.
Altered Beast, which was actually their first pack-in, their first bundle.
And that was the first, whoa. People,
yeah.
Looking back on that game, it looks like shit now, but people lost their damn minds about the
With
graphics.
Altered Beast? Yeah. In your house?
Yeah.
In your home?
This is crazy, right?
Exactly. And their mascot at the time, Alex Kidd, and this was Alex Kidd in the Enchanted Castle was their game in 1989. Now, I also want to mention here, 1990 had a few games, and I'm not saying these are good or bad. I'm just mentioning them, okay? Michael Jackson's Moonwalker.
Great game.
I love
Fantastic
it.
game.
I love it. I don't care.
Did we mention that weird Ghostbusters game?
There's a Ghostbusters game for Genesis.
Fucking awesome.
More sports with Pat Riley's basketball, and a big one here, John Madden football in 1990.
So Sega starts to establish itself a little bit with that John Madden title as sports. Sega does sports.
Sega does sports.
And they're better on Genesis, right? Because they're Super NES. They can't do the sports realist, especially sports a realistic thing, right? So Sega's this is a simulation and it's real and shit, right?
And that's 100% in Sega's credit there. All the sports games, even the ones that are really like Tecmo Bowl is known as one of the best games, on Nintendo. Even that's a rarity. Most of the sports games on Nintendo stunk.
They stunk.
Most of them did. Not all.
To Sega's credit, they identified first of all a thing that needs more horsepower, a simulation kind of deal. Mm-hmm. And they said, we have the most powerful console on the market.
They did.
Let's get John Madden football, right? And they did.
Let's get baseball. Let's get basketball.
Right.
Let's get all the sports out there.
And they called it Sega Sports.
They did.
They had a branding to it.
Yeah,
and
their
everything.
own branding. They also had something very interesting going on. They had attack ads on Nintendo. You might have heard of the famous saying. This was headed up by Michael Katz, who was their president, the former Atari president, mind you.
Mm-hmm.
Genesis does what Nintendo don't.
What Nintendo don't.
Now, Quinn, you and I have talked about Pepsi, the number 2.
Yes.
We have talked about Burger King, the number 2. One of the things that you and I have noticed in these war series is that when you are the number 2, you have much more freedom to say fuck you to the number 1.
Right. And so Sega in very number 2 fashion, very, if you're a wrestling fan, very WCW fashion.
Very New York Mets.
If you're a cola fan, very Pepsi
Very
fashion.
Pepsi, very Burger King.
When you have an advantage, they just rub it in their competitor's face.
Yes.
It's also, to me, always a sign that, when the competitor is going to punch back, you're pretty fucked, right?
Well, yeah, there's also that.
Like, because you're bragging about something that, you just have kind of a couple of a month lead in over the competition, right? Also, on the other hand, I'll say this about Sega's approach here, is it was actually successful because they were able to convince enough people before Nintendo's retaliation to get one of these things. And that's really that install base that they established from 89 to 90 kind of kept them as a true competitor. They
buoyed them.
They were able to establish enough of a base, like enough millions of people, like we're talking millions of people had this thing, that they could say, like, no, we're going to go toe-to-toe with Nintendo.
No matter what they do.
Yeah, because we have the users.
Right. And you know what's interesting is you could look at this two ways. You can look at it as it's not a fair fight. They're the 16-bit console. Of course they're better than this old 8-bit console that was developed in 83. And that is true. On the other hand, you can look at it as brilliant marketing. And that's what it was. They know that Nintendo, of course they know it's unfair, but the slogan, that's a killer slogan, man.
It is. No, it is.
That's a killer slogan.
And I think why it's also a unique time period is because both brands are sort of in their infancy. It's not a known commodity that Nintendo can. What if the NES is just a flash in the pan? What if it's a one-hit product?
Right. What if they wipe out like Atari did?
What if the games get worse?
Right.
There's no established history yet with Nintendo.
There's no precedent.
They've only had good games since 1982 with Donkey Kong.
Yeah, pretty much.
It's still a young market. They could just shit the bed. Right?
Yes,
and
they
Sega's, they're the new kid in town, and they're killing it.
Right.
So maybe you might say, well, maybe they have more of a chance of succeeding here, right?
Good point.
So I'm going to buy a Sega Genesis instead.
So Nintendo comes out in 88 in Japan and in early 1990 in the United States with their most successful Nintendo game of all time in the face of all of this.
This was their retort, really.
Super Mario Brothers 3.
An absolute classic.
He's back. All you had to do was ask. Super Mario Brothers 3 from Nintendo.
To me, personally, it shows the talent of Nintendo as a game company, not as a console company.
As a developer.
As a developer. This thing pushed the NES to its limits.
Parallax scrolling, all of these other things. We can get into
all
it.
The levels.
All the levels.
All the different transformations Mario could do.
The sprites, the graphics.
The way they were creative with the color limitations.
Yep.
The added chips to the cartridge to pull off with it, whatever the fuck they were doing.
Yep.
I mean, this thing was amazing. They got the success they deserved with it because this was... I mean, they returned to form. It wasn't fucking weird like Mario 2.
Yeah.
Like, it was just awesome.
I like Mario 2.
Mario 3 in general was just awesome. It's one of the best games ever made. Yeah.
Even if you're a Genesis fan, you gotta admit that.
And so if I'm Sega and I see that, I gotta think to myself, we might be in trouble.
Right.
Because that's the momentum they're going to have going into their next, to the Genesis competitor, right?
And how is Alex Kidd going to compete with that?
Right, exactly.
Well, they knew this because they installed a new CEO, Tom Kalinske, from Mattel.
Mm-hmm.
And in June of 1991, to get ahead of whatever Nintendo was plotting, now it had already been released in Japan, but in 1991, in anticipation of the U.S. release of the Nintendo successor, they cut the price of the Genesis from $199 to $149. Not only that, Tom Kalinske decided we need a new mascot to compete with Mario.
That Alex Kidd stuff ain't kicking.
He stinks.
Yeah, he's just not as good.
And of course, we came up with the star of the final Master System game, by the way, Sonic the Hedgehog.
Sonic the Hedgehog runs, jumps, moves, and spins at supersonic speed. And now he's loose.
This was huge. Let's just say that. Sonic is like if you've never played Sonic, you basically are a blue hedgehog and you run fast from one side of the board to the next.
But you're cool.
But there's two things here that I think that why this game is so great. The speed, right? That is its main draw, right? Is that this was really using the fact that the Genesis processor was like 7 megahertz or some shit.
7.6.
There was no machine on the market that went that fast. So it could literally do the scrolling like super quick.
Yeah,
right?
That was its claim to fame.
So it was really awesome. It was just a really great tech feat. Tech demo, if you will.
From a video game point of view,
But the level design is fantastic, too. These, like, vertical, like, levels where, you know, he can go up, down, up, and around. You spin. They were doing all this creative shit with, like, where you could, like, go with it. Sometimes it was just absolute chaos. Sometimes you're just going, you're like, I don't even know where I'm going to fucking land. Sometimes they would switch to, like, precision jumping in the stages. Like, it's a really good video game on top of just looking awesome and having a cool mascot.
That's the thing. The game was good, and it installed Sonic as a cool face of the company.
Yeah,
alternative.
And they did cool things like Sonic when he's standing there, his foot, he taps his foot.
Yeah, he would tap his foot impatiently.
He's got Tood.
He's got Tood.
Yeah, he's got Tood. And Mario's kind of very conventional.
He has a mustache.
Right? And I think that Sega was also smart with how they positioned Sonic because in the early 90s, this is where pop culture was going, right? Everything was attitude and that kind of thing, like being a badass, right?
Be Michelangelo, not Leonardo.
Right, exactly.
Or Raphael, maybe.
So Sonic was perfect.
Perfect. Right on the nose.
Right on the money.
Yep.
And Sega had a hit, and they had something to say. Why are you going to get Nintendo? Don't you want to be around for Sonic 2?
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Cool.
Like, this is the coolest shit.
So as Sega has its cool shit, as Sega is doing what Nintendo don't, we are yet to actually find out what Nintendo is releasing to the U.S. market in 1991. However, we will find that out on the other side of this break as we actually get in earnest here the 16-bit wars. Genesis exists. It has been around for 2 years, but Nintendo has not forgotten. They've been developing something. We're going to find out what that is when more Acid Wash Memories returns right after this.
Danita Stokes, president of HAG.
It's bad enough that Sega Genesis has the most 16-bit games, but this new Sonic the Hedgehog, oh, he really duffed my doilies. They say he's incredibly fast. Well, what's the hurry, mister? And about his attitude. Smarty pants! Why can't it be more like that nice boy Mario? Oh! Little brat!
New Sonic the Hedgehog, only on the 16-bit Sega Genesis system.
Introducing the next generation from Nintendo. New Super Mario World. Created especially for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. It's a bit more exciting, a bit more challenging, a bit more graphic, a bit more colorful, a bit more realistic, a bit more levels, a bit more secret, a bit more enemies, a bit more friends, a bit more sound, a bit hotter, a bit cooler, a bit weird, a bit more revolutionary, a bit more Mario, a bit more of what you want. It's 16-bit, and it's yours only if you get new Super Nintendo. Now you're playing with power, superpower.
Burger King asks,
what's your way?
Introducing 3 delicious international chicken sandwiches, fixed, fresh, served hot.
Have it your way!
The Italian way, white meat chicken with mozzarella cheese covered in marinara sauce. The French way, chicken with ham, Swiss cheese, and mayonnaise. The American way, chicken, American cheese, lettuce, tomato, and mayonnaise.
What's your way?
An international chicken sandwich for a limited time at Burger King. Your way, right away.
And now we return to more acid-washed memories.
And welcome back to Acid Wash Memories. This is episode number 15. We are doing the 16-bit wars, and Warren here with me is Michael Quinn. Hello, Michael.
Howdy.
This has been fun.
Yes. It's been a war, really.
These are serious subjects here.
When I was a kid, this was serious.
It absolutely was.
Oh, you like Genesis? What the hell, man?
Yeah, or you like Super Nintendo? That's for babies.
Yeah, exactly.
You know? So we want to hear your stories, folks. Of course, remember to tweet at us at AWM Podcast on Twitter, or join our group and join the discussion there because, like we said, we really mean it. It's friendly there. I'm not just saying that. It's actually nice there.
Mm-hmm.
No one's arguing and making fun of each other, so don't be afraid. Join our group, and thank you for being with us. But, Quinn, we got a lot of ground to cover here on the battlefield. So where we left off, it's the summer of 1991. Tom Kalinske has come in as the new CEO. He has said that Sonic is our guy, right?
Yes.
He's got his own game. Fuck it.
Yeah.
And it's gonna kick whatever Nintendo's doing. It's gonna kick their ass.
He's dope. Sonic the Hedgehog is dope.
Is that what the kids say?
That's what they said.
That's their parlance,
He's
if you
fat.
will. With a PH, right?
That's my 90s, 90s term. Yeah.
Is he all that and a bag of chips, or is that later?
He's definitely all that in a bag of chips, actually. It's not even questionable.
What kind of chips?
Ruffles.
You didn't hesitate on that.
Nintendo would be Lay's.
What's wrong with Lay's?
Because Lay's is more mainstream. Ruffles is like, oh, look, we put ridges on the shit.
A little indie?
Yeah.
All right.
They're very Genesis.
Very Genesis. Ruffles are Genesis.
Yeah.
Ruffles does what Nintendo don't.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Nintendo, meanwhile, over in Japan, they'd first revealed their plan publicly to their NES successor in 1988. So they're already working on this. Whether they knew of the Mega Drive or not, I don't know. They were already saying, well, we got to follow this up.
Right. And I got to say, they, in a weird way, because of Sega making its move, they kind of had some time to figure out, okay, what is working over there in 16-bit land?
Yeah.
We can make adjustments here, right?
Exactly. And they revealed more info publicly about a year later in July of 89, including the comment that there would be a game known as Super Mario Brothers 4. Now, you have to remember, Mario 3 had already been released in Japan in 88. Right. So that's
why we got to see it in The Wizard in 89.
With Fred Savage, that's right.
Yeah.
Speaking of the Wonder Years.
Super Mario Brothers 3!
Super Mario Brothers 4 sounds amazing on paper.
I mean, 3 was amazing. It was like one of the best games ever made. How could 4 be bad?
Right. And on a new console?
Yeah, more power.
More
16 bits?
Yes. Look at all those bits. That's double the bits,
We
Quinn.
got double the bits for Mario.
Extra Mario bits.
Yeah.
What we always wanted. So finally, in November of 1990, the Super Famicom is released in Japan.
Yeah, it's Super. I've always liked this name because it cribs off the concept that this is like the souped up version of the system that you know and love, right?
It's not just the regular version, Quinn. It's Super.
It's Super.
Now, to be fair to the Super Famicom, it did not have as fast of a processor as the Genesis. It was about half the speed, 3.8 or 3.58, megahertz processor.
But to be fair, like the Motorola thing that was being used, I mean, that was overkill even at the time. That thing is like, the thing was more powerful than anything on the market. Most conventional processors of the time did not go as fast as the Motorola.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That is just abnormal.
But it did have double the RAM that the Genesis did. Genesis at 64 kilobit. This was 128. More colors.
The colors was actually, to me, was like a big difference maker between the two. Right? It was like you could tell that like Super Nintendo was more vibrant and colorful.
The Genesis had 512 total and 64 simultaneous on screen. The Super Nintendo, Super Famicom, had 32,768
it was like insane
total.
in comparison. It was really different.
And 258 simultaneous. But not only that, on-screen sprites for the Mega Drive, 80. On-screen sprites for the Super Famicom, 128. Not only that, maximum sprite size for the Mega Drive, 32 by 32. For the Super Famicom, it was double, 64 by 64.
Boring!
So those are some tech specs, and some people don't care about that, and
but
I understand.
There's also a big one.
What is it, Michael?
The big, the hardware feature. The modes.
Mode 7.
Specifically Mode 7.
Specifically was the answer to Genesis blast processing, and that is what they harped on their blast processing with the Sonic games, right?
I mean, they got an advantage in processor speed.
They did.
You might as well use it, right?
And if you look at the tech specs, that's their only advantage, and they just zoomed in on it, which is what a smart marketing person does. Don't get me wrong.
That number bigger than that number.
That's all that they had, though.
Right.
On a tech level.
But this Mode 7 mode, right, this is like a hardware feature. And what it was it could rotate the sprites and do kind of like a faux 3D effect.
Pseudo
right?
3D.
Yeah, and this was put on display prominently in one of the launch games being F-Zero.
Yes.
Right.
F-Zero was one of the launch games in 1990, obviously in Japan, and 1991 in the United States. We'll talk about the launch games in 1 second. It's a great point. I just want to mention, when it was released in August of 91 as the Super Nintendo, the launch price was $199, which is why Tom Kalinske had lowered the Genesis to $149 only a couple of months earlier. And that's brilliant, too.
Yeah, they undercut them.
Undercut them.
And I feel like there was, for Nintendo, that's rough because there's nothing they can do about that. They don't have 2 years built in of sales to justify lowering it $50, right?
And they're still supporting the NES at this time.
Right.
Whereas Master System is not.
They could eat the cost, but I mean, they're also fucking Nintendo. Like, do they need to?
No.
You know what I'm saying?
And they didn't. So the launch titles was a small list, but a well-known list, I would think.
If you're a Nintendo launch
fan.
Lineup.
So Pilot Wings,
another Mode 7 beauty
Mode
right
7
there.
display.
Pilot Wings is a great game, by the way. I think it's overlooked.
A flying game,
game, and it kind of like turns into a weird like military thing at the end. It's fucking awesome.
F-Zero, Quinn alluded to, that's a really fast, cool-looking racing game for
F-Zero,
its time.
believe it or not, is actually one of my favorite Super Nintendo games to
I
this
know.
day. I
love it.
Love it. It's a game that I will just play for no fucking reason on an emulator when I'm bored.
It's a great game. Gradius 3 was another one.
Fantastic one. Although Gradius, you know what's funny about Gradius is
What?
that the Super Nintendo comes out and immediately this game is like too much shit on the screen and it like slows down. It's
slows down.
Great idea, Konami. Like just let's make the console look like shit immediately.
Although Konami always gets a pass in my book.
Yeah,
I love Konami.
I mean, getting Gradius 3 in the home, I think that was the draw because that was a 1989 like full fat arcade game. Like it was like a huge deal.
It's a huge deal to have this in your home, and that's kind of their answer to Altered Beast, I think.
Right, they're saying, look, we can put a crazy arcade game in our system too.
Correct. SimCity,
the Nintendo SimCity is great.
Yeah, it's fun.
It's
right?
totally different. Like
Yes,
it's so
the PC,
weird and like it's cute and it's fun.
It's fun, and of course, it's killer app. Super Mario World, which was also a pack-in.
Mario World.
A bit more revolutionary, a bit more Mario, a bit more of what you want. It's 16-bit, and it's yours only if you get new Super Nintendo. Now you're playing with power, superpower.
Now this, to me, is one of the holy trinity of the 16-bit era. This is
a huge deal, man.
I mean, this game is great. It's more Mario, different powers, different area. But on top of it, it adds the like puzzle aspect where you got to like leave the stages in a certain way.
Yes.
And like you can open up extra levels and things like that.
Expand upon 3.
It was just very creative and innovative at the time. And because it came packed in, I mean, everyone played this thing.
Everyone played it. It's a great game.
It's a classic.
It's absolutely a classic. You know what? Why don't we run down some other games from 91 here? Super Nintendo came out with Final Fantasy IV,
which was Final Fantasy II at the time.
Yes, I know.
Because of the whole fucking naming thing. But Final Fantasy II was great. I've beaten that game. I loved it.
Yeah,
I it was fantastic. I'm a Final Fantasy fan, admittedly.
I know you are.
But Final Fantasy II. Really like a huge jump.
Yes.
And it played great. It looked great. It had great music. It used that Super Nintendo sound chip that was also kind of we haven't touched on too much. But
one of the things about the Super Nintendo audio versus the Genesis, and I'm not saying one is better. Technically, the Super Nintendo is better, but I'm saying people might prefer one to the other. Super Nintendo had near CD quality audio.
It was like sample based.
Yes,
you could put in like short samples in succession. It wasn't quite CD, but it was close.
It was close.
It was close. Yeah.
Whereas Genesis was basically doing chiptune, but better than Nintendo could.
So it was just it was a Yamaha synthesizer.
Yeah.
That is all preference to a lot of people.
Oh, 100%.
But it was definitely a strength for the Super Nintendo.
Yeah, and they have some great soundtracks. Sega, though, in 1991 released their home version of a tremendous racing game. I love this game. Outrun. Awesome racing game.
Outrun, one of my favorite racing games ever.
Awesome game.
And it was amazing at the time. Again, it's in the home.
Yeah,
like it's
a home
classic
version.
Arcade game.
Love it
in the home, and I think there was a Master System, but it looked crappy compared to on the Genesis.
And I think PC Engine got their or TurboGrafx got their hands. I call it that because when I played the emulator all the time, it was always PC Engine emulator. You know what I mean? But it's TurboGrafx in the US. Super Ghouls and Ghosts was another big one for Nintendo in 1991.
Great game, and graphically very.
That's the thing.
What a jump! I mean, it looked like the arcade.
Jump. It looked like the arcade.
Looked like the fucking arcade.
Again, Nintendo's showing like, no, we're gonna do this too.
We got Gradius and Super Ghouls and Ghosts.
Right,
like this shit is great.
Right.
Look, it just looks. You don't even have to go put the coins in anymore. You just get this.
But Sega had another great racing game. One of my sentimental favorites, so I had to include it.
Yeah.
Road Rash.
Road Rash, another
motorcycle racing
This
game.
is kind of like a newish franchise at the time.
It was. It was the first one.
And it's just people loved it. It's just it's a 16-bit classic, right?
It's a if you've never played played it. It's a motorcycle racing game, but you can also punch the other drivers.
Right,
and
it's like a combat style, right?
Yeah, and it's supposed to be illegal, which is why the cops chase you.
Right, which is very Genesis.
I love it, man.
It's the ethos of Genesis, right?
I'd say it is
rebellious,
the ethos. Now, in 1992, before we get to the games, I just want to mention a couple of things, Quinn. Nintendo gave in and they lowered their price to $149 to match the Genesis.
Crazy that quick. They were
Only
just
a year in.
And that shows you how fierce the competition was.
Correct.
Right?
So guess what Sega did? They went to $129.
Fucking insane. See, this is the best form of competition.
It is, though.
It's like Sega responding, and you're like, $129, that's like insane. Like, if you really think about it, for like a brand new video game system.
It's only like $40 more than some Nintendo games would be.
Yeah.
Later, right?
Yeah.
Now, in 1992, there were some games. Now, we are not, I want to be very clear about this. We are not running through every game ever released on either console, so if we miss something, it's just because of time constraints and not because we don't like the game.
If your favorite gets missed, we're sorry.
We're really sorry.
Sorry.
Super Nintendo released in 1992. Another one of the big three.
My favorite. Speaking of favorite
personal
games.
favorite. Legend of Zelda 3, A Link to the Past.
Oh, my.
Michael?
It established the Zelda formula that would be taken through Ocarina and all the other Zeldas up until Breath of the Wild, the newest one. It's a classic. The classic,
it
like
is.
It's got the light world and the dark world, which again, the trope of Zelda that would be used forever and ever. You know, you go through dungeons.
I liked it as a
You
kid.
figure out the puzzles, and it was just great. And graphically, it just, what a jump again for Zelda in
From
general.
Zelda 1?
Yeah, what a
Good
jump.
Lord.
It goes back to the Zelda 1 format, not the side-scrolling Zelda 2.
yep.
The classic third one that always goes back to the...
Yes.
Yeah, you know.
It's the game that's already a legend. The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past, only on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System.
What a heavy hitter for Nintendo there.
Chef's kiss, man.
For 92 for them.
Absolutely.
Huge game.
So Sega, obviously, on their side of the coin, they said, you know what? We've got something up our sleeve.
Mm-hmm.
Sonic the Hedgehog 2.
Great game.
Featuring Tails.
Tails enters the building here.
Miles
Tails Prowers, or whatever his name is.
Now, when you buy the Sega Genesis that comes with Sonic 1, you'll get Sonic 2 absolutely free. Sonic 2 handles stubborn stains, embarrassing bald spots, no problem. It even slices and dices, makes thousands of julienne fries. But wait, you can play it too.
There's like a tag team mode where you can the split screen. You know, you can get the emeralds. There's those like faux 3D stages.
Yeah,
like
man.
Sega starts saying, hey, you know, they got that mode, so we could do some 3D
We'll do some
shit.
3D.
I mean, when that got shown off, I mean, that looked really impressive at the time.
Sonic 2, I loved.
Yeah.
Loved
Sonic 2 was fantastic. It also
Fantastic
added
game.
the spin dash for Sonic.
Yeah.
And just great tracks, music-wise, for Sega. I'll say this is like consistently one of the trends we're seeing here is Sonic. Sonic in the Genesis era really showed the fuck up. Like
Absolutely.
all the Sonic games were great.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
However, Nintendo had another heavy hitter in 1992. It was the first mainstream, I think it actually was the first overall, a home console version of a huge arcade smash known as Street Fighter II.
A phenomenon, if you will.
Yeah.
Super Nintendo with Street Fighter 2. It's unbeatable.
Street Fighter 2
revolutionized the fighting game industry.
It's like all fighting games are based off Street Fighter 2.
Yeah.
Like it's the one,
It
right?
was the
Every
one.
fighting game before Street Fighter, even Street Fighter 1 sucks butt
It's not
compared to
good.
Street Fighter 2.
It's not good.
Street Fighter 2 is great, and there, of course, would be all the successive versions of Street Fighter 2. You know, Turbo's the one that was one of my favorites, and Super Turbo on Super Nintendo. But, I mean, how could you go wrong with Street Fighter 2? And having the first version...
Yeah, Capcom had exclusivity with Nintendo at the time.
The thing to me that Super Nintendo always had, the edge on Street Fighter, is the controller was kind of perfect for it.
Well,
it had 6 buttons.
Can we talk about that for a second?
Yeah.
So the controllers between these two systems. So Super Nintendo's control was a 4 face buttons, you know, A, B, X, and Y, 2 shoulder buttons, L and R.
Why that was thought to be, even the X and Y part, they were thinking in the early days of 3 dimensions. That's like what was going on in their brains, why they picked what they picked.
X and Y axis, right?
And the left and right also was, you know, they figured, maybe you'd have to turn a camera or something.
Right.
So this is like the early days of thinking about that stuff because they knew they had this mode 7, right?
Yes.
So like that's why they built the controller. And can we say that the Super Nintendo controller, I feel like most modern controllers are basically that controller?
I would say PlayStation took cues from that. with the shoulder
Absolutely.
buttons and the 4 face
And
buttons.
even the Xbox one, even the current Nintendo one, they're
agree.
all for the Switch. They're all just
I would agree.
a variation, like things piled on to the Super Nintendo controller. Kind of figured out the format.
I think so, and I think Sega botched it with their first control with just 3 face buttons, A, B, and C.
Now, to Sega's credit at the time, if you think about it, right? If you're Sega,
okay, I know where
the
you're going.
NES has
Go ahead.
2 buttons.
Yep.
What if we had a third button? Right? It's like
fair enough.
So to them in '89,
enough.
that seems insanely awesome.
Good
right?
point. But they wouldn't have had the foresight to see Street Fighter because it wasn't out yet in '88.
And Street Fighter really always felt to me it like necessitated the need for 6 because you had this smash hit game.
Yes.
That's very obviously a 6-button game.
So Sega's 6-button control, I do want to say, is a lot smaller and more comfortable than their standard. And Sega's 6-button is an excellent controller.
It's a great controller, yeah. But the problem was it didn't come bog standard with the system.
Correct.
And so it's an added expense,
Yeah,
right? It's
exactly.
like, okay, now I got to get a controller to play Street Fighter.
Right.
And I could just, on Super, I get the game and it plays.
Right, just
like,
play it.
Yeah.
But Sega had, in 1992, one of my personal favorite games.
Probably one of the best games on the system.
Definitely my favorite beat-em-up, except the arcade version of Final Fight.
Right.
Is Streets of Rage 2.
What can you say?
Top to bottom, Quinn.
Absolute fucking classic. I mean, the thing about Streets of Rage 2 to me is that how sneakily it was like the best beat 'em up, right?
Yes,
it's because
it is the answer to Final Fight. Let's
it
be
is
clear.
the answer to Final Fight, but Final Fight got all the fanfare because it was at the launch of Super Nintendo.
It's
and
Capcom.
It's Capcom, and it was considered a feat to bring the game home.
Correct.
I mean, they kind of rushed it to Super Nintendo. That's why there's only like one player and stuff like that.
In the
because
first one,
they
yeah.
just they were like, we got to get this the fuck on the Super, right?
The Final Fight guy, or
Yeah.
you'd be him.
Exactly, but these were consequences of because they just needed to get this 1989 arcade game into a 1990 console.
Correct.
Right? Like,
But Streets of Rage, the first Streets of Rage is whatever. It's not bad.
right.
But Streets of Rage 2,
I mean, they just turn it up to 11.
fucking A, man. They get first of all the soundtrack in that.
Yeah, the guy who made that, it just what the fuck? Like, it's one of the best soundtracks. Like, first of all, it's on Genesis, has
Right.
the inferior sound, but the
Yes.
soundtrack just totally works with it.
Love it.
Right? Plus, you got like all the characters on top of it. You know, they have the usual like punch, and you can jump kick, and you got the one button that does a special move, just like Final Fight, where you have the one, if you hold
Yeah.
the two, it does. But then there's also like combination, where you can hit like forward punch, and you can do an uppercut with Axel and stuff. Like all this
that
shit.
Axel, yeah.
Like you could just do all this cool shit. It was one of those games too that was just highly replayable. You just remember the stages, you
game.
turn the difficulty up, and you just keep trying and trying. It's just a great game.
Tremendous game. Super Nintendo, Mario wasn't fucking around either because Mario Paint was a huge one, Quinn.
This, looking back, people might laugh at this, right? It's like, what, Paint for fucking Windows is
Right.
on Super Nintendo?
It was
But
great, man.
this,
Loved it.
you have to remember that, when you were a kid and computers were new, what was the first thing you played with on your parents' computer? Paint. You're always fucking around with Paint. It's like Nintendo just saw that and they said, bingo.
Yeah.
It's like, what if we Mario-ized this? Like, put Nintendo shit all over the place. Like, you had all these stamps and all this shit.
Animation,
music.
The fly swatting game.
The fly swat. Like, they put everything in this, and it was like a playground for kids.
I
like,
loved it.
It was
Oh my
such
God,
a good
I
idea.
loved it.
And, like, to me, Mario Paint exemplifies Nintendo's, like, creativity.
Yes.
They can put their spin on anything, and it's totally new and different.
And it worked, man.
Yeah.
Mario and a mouse. That's what
Right.
it was. I mean, that's the
They
marketing.
came with a mouse,
that's the
too,
pitch, yeah.
and I think a lot of people thought they were going to make more mouse games, but they ended up only making like one or two.
Handful, yeah.
And the third party seemed to not support it for whatever
Right.
reason, but hey, man, I thought that was totally
Great
a unique,
game.
cool thing on Super Nintendo.
Love Mario Paint. I just wanted to mention the Sports Talk Baseball was released on Genesis in 92. They had a Sports Talk series, and it had commentary, and that was kind of a groundbreaking
Gotcha.
thing.
Yeah.
So it was a cool deal.
That
But-
plays right into Sega's branding of sports.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Sega was very good at the sports games.
Right. They were killing it with the sports.
They really were.
Yeah,
Better
they
than...
were appealing to teenagers with that. I
That's
think
the
is
thing.
that's what was so smart about it, and that's what kept Sega in the game.
Well, and all the sports, Quinn, in the 90s were hot. All of them.
Yep, you had Michael Jordan.
Yeah, you had Wayne Gretzky.
Joe Montana. And
baseball.
The Dallas Cowboys of the time. And
Yeah, yes.
there were so many sports things.
Sports things were hot. Super Mario Kart, though, was also A sleeper hit in 1992.
Yeah, believe it or not, I saw a documentary on this recently, and I did not realize how many copies of Mario Kart actually sold. Like it was,
God, it was huge.
I mean,
Quinn.
I
this gaming historian.
all my friends, gaming historian, but all my friends had it. I had it, but I mean, I didn't just. It came out of like nowhere.
It snuck up on people, right?
It just all of a sudden there's like a game and there's the Mario characters and you race, and it just seems so like such a basic idea on its face. But it was fun as hell. Like it was, all the courses were fun, and it had the battle mode.
Yeah, and the music was good.
The music was good. What's so crazy to think is there was no Mario Kart game before this.
Nope.
And after it became one of Nintendo's main
flagship.
franchise.
Yeah.
I mean, to this day,
starting with 64,
they always have a Mario Kart for whatever system they have out. And they've launched with Mario Kart on successive systems.
That's good.
That's how popular Mario Kart is.
It's a great idea.
Yeah.
And if you haven't seen the Gaming Historian's documentary on it, I highly recommend it.
Yeah, I think it's just because, too, it's just so easy to play, and like even older people can play it. They can pick it up, hit the gas, brake, that's it.
Essentially, that's what it is.
You fucking drive the guy. Like, like it's easy.
You drive the guy.
And it's approachable because it's Mario, right? You got Mario on it, so there's nothing offensive in it or anything.
It's approachable.
Yeah.
Good point. Speaking of approachable and inoffensive, Echo the Dolphin for Genesis.
Echo the Dolphin
Big game.
Yeah, Echo the Dolphin actually is kind of like, I feel like it's a pretty artsy game for the time, right?
Pretty
it's
good game.
It's kind of like, it's just interesting,
Yeah.
right? You're the dolphin and you got to kind of figure out where to go. And, but I mean, it just had
it's good.
It has a vibe.
It has a certain vibe, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like a chilled out kind of like,
right, yeah.
I like that game.
But a cool, interesting game for Sega there.
100%. In 1992, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were still very popular. They had arcade games. They had Nintendo games.
The movies.
So let's get them to the 16-bit era. So Super Nintendo comes out with one of my all-time favorite games.
One of the best beat-em-ups, like rivaling Streets of Rage 2. Yeah.
Turtles in Time.
Turtles in Time.
Let's kick shout.
Turtles in Time is basically the arcade game Turtles 4 just brought home. I think what's stunning about it is the accuracy. It might be better than the arcade version. I mean, in some ways, because some people actually have music preferences. They like the Super versus the arcade, or some people like the arcade better than... And yes, the arcade's graphically superior, but it's pretty damn close.
It's real close. They throw the items at the foot soldiers at the camera. That's mode 7, I believe.
That's using mode 7,
yeah.
And the arcade, I'm sure, it used some custom shit on a Konami board. But the fact that they were able to accomplish the same effect at home using the features that Nintendo had the foresight to put into the console.
I love it because it feels endless. All the different stages, all the different enemies, all the different bosses,
the time periods,
like prehistoric Turtlesaurus and all that.
And it even had the little audio bursts in there, so it's like, oh, it is like the arcade.
Barry Marshall wounded me and all that
Big
stuff.
Apple. Yeah.
It's 3 a.m.
Yeah, I know. It just sounds...
Alley Cat Blues.
The only one that's inaudible is 3 a.m.
Big Apple, 3 a.m.
Yeah.
I love the game. Now, Genesis... To its credit, at least to its credit,
they tried.
They tried with the Hyperstone heist.
I feel like Konami gave them the shaft on this. Like,
this was themselves the shaft with their hardware.
This was up to Konami to figure out, right? I mean, this is a third-party game, right?
They didn't,
Hyperstone heist. Well, okay, I'll say this about it: it looks good.
It's not bad.
It looks good. It's comparable to Turtles in Time. It doesn't have the music. It doesn't have the same... The fact that they went for like a completely different game when basically everyone just wanted to play the arcade game at home was a little weird.
Well, because the Hyperstone... Is it shrink things? That's what it is, right?
I don't even remember what the story is. I just remember the stages are just similar-ish, but with like a different premise.
There's some different character. Like Tatsu is in this one for some weird reason.
Yeah, it's odd.
It's a little bit weird, but it's not bad.
It's not bad. It plays identical to Turtles in Time.
Except for the throwing the guy at the screen.
Right, it's not in there.
So in this case, Nintendo did what Genesis can't.
Right.
That's not as catchy, though. Anyway,
now Nintendo's ahead in the hardware department.
There you go.
No longer Sega's ahead.
Ace is the place.
Stop.
Speaking of 1993, before we get there, Genesis in the 16-bit market had 55% of it.
It's crazy.
They were ahead of Super Nintendo.
I remember this in the first couple of years. It looked like Genesis was going to hold on.
Absolutely.
It really, really did.
And in 1993, there were some great games released for both systems. We're going to run them down real quick.
Boy, oh boy. But can we, with that 55 number, look at the game output, Joe.
God, it's insane this year.
Like they are just throwing the heaviest of punches at each other, right?
93 might be the peak of the war.
Maybe 94. It's debatable. 94
92, 93,
might be.
94.
Yeah, 94 is a good year too.
Also a good year. So Nintendo, and this is not specifically in order, but we're just giving you the names. So Super Nintendo comes out with fucking Star Fox.
This thing, I couldn't even believe it was real.
This isn't even just Mode 7, Quinn. This is Super FX.
Yeah, this is... So I saw this in a magazine, and I was like, what? I'd heard of 3D games, right? And then Nintendo just says, hey, we got this game with a fox and a spaceship, and it's in 3D.
That's what it was.
And I was like, Mom? Like, you know what I mean? So I go get this thing, and I plug it in, and, it starts up, Air Force One, and you go through the thing. It's all 3D.
All 3D.
And you go out, and you're driving the ship in 3D. Now, I don't know anything about fucking frame rates in 1993.
Of course.
The game runs at, like, garbage, like, it's all slow and shit, but what the fuck do I know,
You don't
right?
know this in 93.
Right? I'm like, this is insane. And I played the shit out of Star Fox. I must have beaten it a million times. Like, because it was one of those games that only had like a couple of levels.
Yeah.
So you kind of zoom through it.
But man, to have that in your home.
Oh my God. It was crazy. I was like, I remember thinking, because the war was heated at the time, like, how is Genesis even going to beat this? Like, this is insane.
And they really didn't have a game like Star Fox.
I don't think they could really answer to it.
No. But they did have some good games. Well, one of them was the X-Men game, the first X-Men game.
Yeah, and X-Men's an interesting one because I remember the way it starts. It starts like it has like a prologue or some shit. Very interesting game. So X-Men was pretty good.
Good stuff. Super Nintendo finally got Final Fight 2 out in 93.
Now this, I like it.
It's not Streets of Rage, though, man.
It's still not Streets of Rage.
It's not.
Right?
And I love Capcom, and I love their beat 'em. I really do, but
it's kind of like Capcom kind of fell behind here. Like
a little bit.
Streets of Rage by Sega of all people.
Yeah,
it kind of beat them.
Their own thing.
Yeah.
Nothing to do with Capcom.
Right.
Genesis released Jurassic Park. That was
it's another
big
classic,
game.
good license to get. 93, the year
when it
Jurassic.
Came out.
Yeah, when it came out, and I mean, it was a huge hit.
Huge hit.
And it looked cool. I remember it was in the game room at my camp, and people were always playing it.
Your camp stories. Yeah. Now, Street Fighter II Turbo came out on Super Nintendo in 93, and I want to make mention that at the same time, Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition.
So finally, Capcom ports it to Sega Genesis.
Yes.
Not only are you going to get a sneak preview, but you'll be getting strategies, tips, and techniques on some of the coolest new moves in the Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition for the Sega Genesis.
Street Fighter II Turbo and Street Fighter II Special Champion are ostensibly the same game. Mm-hmm. One is modeled after Champion and one is modeled after Turbo. Listen, the Super Nintendo one is better.
Again, the controller. Now, to be fair, I mean, I think by 93 they had the...
This is why they released it.
Yeah. So the controller comes out, but again, I mean, the problem is that every Super Nintendo owner just has the fucking controller already.
Yeah.
Like, so it's just, there's nothing Sega can do about that. It's not really their fault, again, because it's just when they released it and what seemed good at the time. There's no way to predict the future. Let's be fair.
Very fair, Quinn.
Yeah.
I will say that I've played both extensively. I think that I actually really prefer the Super Nintendo one. Yeah. I've played them both. My brother had the console. I played both in emulation. Super Nintendo's is better, in my opinion. Super Mario All-Stars came out in the fall of 93, and this was huge. This is basically a reskin.
Loved this game.
Of the first 3, 1, 2, and 3, and also the Japanese Super Mario 2.
We finally got Lost Levels.
Levels. This revamped the music and the graphics for the 3 classic games we knew.
You know, they like to make remake games all the time these days, but this is the OG remake, right?
Huge seller.
Yeah.
I had dreams as an 8-year-old about finally this coming out so I could buy it.
When I saw the commercials, I was the same way. I could not wait to get this.
And I got it. I loved it.
It was so good.
And it had save states.
Yeah, you could save the game.
It was just great.
I mean, it was just, it added all the things that World added, like saving and stuff, to the old games.
Absolutely.
And it was just amazing.
In Super Mario All-Stars, 4 complete Mario games, including the never-seen Lost Levels. You can't get more Mario than this.
And Sonic Spinball was also released.
This was a fun game.
Huge seller.
Super fun game.
Huge seller in 93.
It put Sonic on pinball, basically, and that's what we get, and it was just so cool.
Secret of Mana was released.
Great game. I personally, as like an RPG person, like a classic, and it needed to happen, like adding action to the RPG or whatever.
Yes.
It's very like exploitable, and like you can there's like things where you can like just hit the boss once, run away, hit him again, and it's like the boss is like stuck in a stunned state. Like it's aged badly, I think, and they eventually made a remake of it and stuff. But again, at the time, it was huge.
Yes, it was.
It was huge because it was
game.
like, you like Final Fantasy, but you also like action.
Action.
Right?
Good
what if we
action.
combine the two together? Great game.
There you go. NFL Football 94 was a huge seller for Genesis in 93.
Sega Sports, baby.
Yep, Sega Sports. The Aladdin games, Disney's Aladdin.
This is one of the weirdest cases,
Yes,
right?
both consoles.
So Disney and Capcom, of all people, tag team up and they make Aladdin, a movie that came out in 1993, right?
Yeah.
Super popular,
Great
right?
movie.
And both
If you're a
these
kid.
games come out, and you would think on its face, because even the covers are the same.
Yep.
Like, you would think on its face, oh, it's just like the Sega version and the Super, but they're totally fucking different video games.
And this is a case where I think the Genesis version is infinitely superior.
Here's the thing: is
There you go.
I grew up with the Super version.
Well, I
I
did
played the
too.
Genesis version, but you know what I think that the Super one has that's a little different is that it's more platforming based because you're jumping off
Yes.
people's heads and stuff.
It's more of a platformer.
And you're also way more like your mobility is better because you can pop off everyone's head. Like you're flying all over the fucking screen. And like that's the one thing I like about it.
But there's more sword action in the Genesis.
Right. So
Quinn.
the sword,
A lot
on
of
the other hand, the sword's awesome.
I know.
Right? Who doesn't like the fucking sword?
Who doesn't want the sword?
So, I mean, it really is kind of like, it's almost like a gameplay preference. It's not even like a...
Yeah, that's
like,
true.
You know what I'm saying? It's like, what do you like to do?
What do you like to do? Stab people or jump on people?
Yeah, you could also like climb on the edges too.
True.
In the Super, which was cool.
We would be remiss if we didn't mention at the very end of '93 a huge one for Super
Massive.
Nintendo. Mega Man X.
Mega Man X, one of the best Mega Man games ever. I always thought it was funny that it was called X, but like
It's
they
not 10.
were only at 6 on
Seven.
NES.
7, right? Came out on Super Nintendo,
7
right?
came on Super, but X comes out and like you're like, what the fuck? 10.
It's not 10, Quinn.
So X comes out and it is just like, what if we upgraded absolutely fucking everything in Mega Man, right?
That's what it is.
Like whereas 7 was like, what if we just made it like the next version of an NES game?
Yes.
X was like, you can super dash and you can charge up. Like you could charge up in the other ones, but like you can upgrade your gear. Like on Mega Man, it's awesome.
Great
like,
game.
Great music,
All-timer.
great stages, great enemies. Like they nailed it on that one.
And it had its own sequels, X2 and X3.
X2 and X3, which are also great.
Also
games.
very good. Now, in 1993, this is probably the biggest point of contention in the war and a very emblematic, I think, happening for the war. September 13th, 93, of course, as we all know if we grew up, was known as Mortal Monday.
Mortal Monday.
Because the hit Midway arcade game, Mortal Kombat...
Taking the arcades by storm.
So this, and there will be an episode one day, but, you know, Mortal Kombat was the violent little brother answer to Street Fighter 2.
Yes.
It was. I mean, that was the intention. It was the snide, you know, like sarcastic developers' answer to Street Fighter 2. Mortal Kombat, huge arcade smash in 92.
I mean, it was one of the biggest game in the world at the time.
Yeah, it was.
Right?
I remember the crowds that would be around the machines.
I mean, you go to the machines, and I mean, people couldn't believe it. The blood, the fatalities,
Right.
all the special moves, everything. It was just everything about it. It just had a cool factor to
Cool
it.
factor.
It came from Midway too.
And it was Midway.
It's just weird.
The
It came out of nowhere.
Yeah, and the blood was a huge part of it.
Right.
So September 13, 93 was going to be Mortal Monday, where it was finally released to the home consoles. However, Nintendo of America and Japan, which had their own self-censorship rules, decided that this violent video game was going to be severely, and as it turned out, detrimentally toned down for our system.
Now, to Nintendo, this was a strategic move because Congress was starting to get
They were getting
riled.
very pissy.
Nintendo figured, listen, we'll tone it down so they don't get on our asses, right?
Right.
Sega, on the other hand, is like, fuck that.
Fuck
We
Kipper
want to
Gore.
sell video
Right,
games.
and Joe
Like,
Lieberman or whoever
right,
it was.
yeah. So Genesis goes along with it. But they add a blood code. So that they could so that they can get around it.
It's
right?
not in the game.
It's not really in the
You need
game,
to know
right?
the
But
code.
if everyone always enters the code before they begin the game.
You need to know the code that we give to GamePro and EGM and put in our own magazine, Sega Visions, you know?
It's even in the instruction manual.
It's in everything.
Yeah.
It's Abacab.
Yeah.
Anyway, here's the deal with the Mortal Kombat. On a technical level, the music, the graphics, the gameplay are all inferior on Genesis. But what it fucking had was all of the arcade fatalities.
Little red blood spurts.
And the blood.
Yeah.
And that is why it was always known as better.
It was the one.
Yeah, on Genesis. So let's head into 94 now. And in 1994, I do want to make mention, the market in the 16-bit market is dipping 17% in revenue in 94.
Mm-hmm.
But the games are still great here. So
I would say 94 is the last competitive year.
There's some good stuff in 5.
There's some good stuff in 5, and Super's really going, but Sega starts turning their attention.
Yeah, elsewhere, which we'll get to. So in 1994, the third of the big 3 is finally released on Super Nintendo. We had Mario. We had Zelda and Link. We need Super Metroid.
Super Metroid. Probably one of the greatest games ever made. Period. End of story.
End of discussion. End of quotation.
I mean, expertly constructed as far as the stages. I mean, plus adding the feature of having a map in the corner of the screen so you knew where the fuck you were. You could hit start and look at the full map. Like all the powers to get past all the doors, all the bosses. It could be run fast. It could be run at your own leisure. I mean, people like after they beat the game were playing it to see how fast
just
they could
to see what they could do. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it was just wild, and like
absolutely,
to this day, it's played competitively for speed. Also, the ambiance, it's like kind of got a scary feel to it.
Great feel to it.
Just great music too.
But Sega was no slouch in 94, Quinn, because they released their third Sonic game proper. This was known as Sonic and Knuckles.
Right. Well, there's Sonic 3. There's a story.
Yes, there's Sonic 3, but Sonic and Knuckles.
Sonic 3 comes out, but like while Sonic 3 came out to meet a deadline, and the developers really weren't done with it yet.
Correct.
And so their concept was, we'll essentially release an expansion for the game, right?
Which they did.
But what was so unique about this, and I think why it was such a hit, is they said you attach your Sonic 3 cart to the Sonic and Knuckles. But not only that, you can attach Sonic 1 and 2, and it will like do things to it.
You can play as Knuckles.
You play as Knuckles.
Not only is it the greatest Sonic game ever, it also comes with lock-on technology. Plug in Sonic 2 and use Knuckles to play in a whole new way.
What a cool side effect to like try. They rushed a game, but we got something better because they did that.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
And it just worked out. And Sonic and Knuckles, like I played it a couple years back, and I was like, this holds up, man. This is a great fucking Sonic game.
Yeah, it is. So they weren't a slouch.
Yeah.
For both consoles in 94, a huge, heavy hitter, fondly remembered.
For all of them. It was on every
console.
Yeah.
It had been a Smash Arcade game in 93. Midway
Another
again.
Midway beauty.
NBA Jam.
Jam.
Boom, God, what a game.
Everyone was playing this show.
This was the sarcastic basketball game.
This was the this is the edgy attitude basketball
satirical
game. Gigantic dunks. You could jump into the sky. You play as Bill Clinton. Like you do
and
fucking anything. Like it was like
I loved it.
It was so cool. I just remember every Saturday playing this with my friends,
God, into
the late hours.
No, I played it on Super mainly.
Yeah, a Super also.
But I think I played the Genesis. I mean, it's fine, but Super just looks better.
Right.
You know what I mean? It just is. Sorry. Mm-hmm. Another game that came out for both consoles.
Another playing all weekend game here.
Yes. Now, I want to mention, in light of what we were talking about with Joe Lieberman and all that, in September of 94, something called the ESRB was formed.
So finally they settle how they're going to so that we don't have these incidents now where Mortal Kombat's like bloody on one and not the other.
Right.
It's like there's just a uniform this is what standards it has to meet to be released.
Independent of Nintendo or Genesis.
Right.
So with that in mind, Nintendo dropped their own self-censorship. And thus, Mortal Kombat 2, the highly anticipated follow-up.
It's gonna have blood on both.
And it did, and I'll tell you what, the Super Nintendo version kicked the ass of Genesis in this case.
And this was because Nintendo didn't have to hold back, and because it was graphically a superior console.
It was.
It just became the definitive version of the game.
Well, because you can see the fatalities better.
Yeah. The characters were bigger.
Yeah, it just looked and sounded better.
Closer to the arcade than the Genesis one.
Sorry if you like Genesis, but it's true. Yeah. Now, Nintendo teamed up with Rare.
This was another fucking late in the game, what the fuck.
This, and before we say the title, this is one of the most beautiful looking Super Nintendo games.
It's unbelievable.
Beautiful sounding Super Nintendo games. And the gameplay is stellar. And it's just a side scroller with an old established Nintendo character.
Character that had been gone for quite a bit.
Good point. But I got to tell you, folks, Donkey Kong Country,
great game,
an all-time Super Nintendo game.
This ended my 94, the Christmas of 94.
Yeah.
I've been playing all these other games all year.
Late 94 release.
And this thing came around, and it was just, I couldn't, I was like, I don't even need to get a new console.
Right.
Like, this is it's 3D. It wasn't. I know that
it
now.
Wasn't, but it was
like
beautiful.
They scanned in images or whatever.
Yeah.
Simply mind-blowing. Best
best-looking video game, period. Spectacular.
It was awesome, and the music was good. And like you said, it did everything right.
It hits all the. It's like Sonic,
had all the secrets and like all this fun shit to do.
It has the Sonic style where you're collecting bananas instead of rings, but you're playing it like Mario, so it's very easy to play.
If you get one hit, you die.
But you get one hit,
you get a
die,
tag partner.
But you have Diddy.
You have Diddy, or sometimes Diddy's in the front, and you got Donkey as your tag partner.
But you can ride in barrels. Like, it's very creative and all-time game.
It's all different types of stages. You're right. It's like some just side scrollers, some you're in like a mine cart, or
Minecart
shooting
Madness.
out of a barrel, or you're swimming.
Yeah,
like,
the swimming, you ride like a frog or a dolphin or a rhino.
There's different animals to ride.
Great
It
shit, man.
It had a lot of good shit in it.
Great game. I want to mention, special mention of the Power Rangers game on
They
Genesis.
were fun.
Very good.
What the fuck?
The
like,
Genesis
you wouldn't think.
ones especially.
You wouldn't think, but both of them, I liked them on both systems.
I liked them both.
They were great.
Now, in 95, I want to mention, there was another dip, a 19% dip in the 16-bit.
Yes, and that's because a little other
ramping
like
up
a
for
future
something,
thing comes, and people know that's winding down. But I got to say, Nintendo did keep it going with the games.
Oh, they absolutely did.
Because they knew that their next one, they had a year or two more to go.
Yes.
Right? So, plus the Super Nintendo was released a year or two later, so I mean, it all makes sense, right?
Genesis did have a 2-year head start
so
in the
Sega's
US.
petering off, but Super Nintendo still got a good year left.
Oh, God, yeah. So Mortal Kombat 3 comes out for both home consoles in 95.
To me, it's the same story.
Although Mortal Kombat 3 as a whole is not as well regarded as 2.
I don't like it as much.
I don't either. Now, I'm mentioning Genesis games for the shit of it. So Saturday Night Slam Master is one of my favorite. Like,
now, this is on both, isn't it?
It's on both, but the Genesis one came out in 95 specifically, and I just wanted to mention it. However, Super Nintendo's got the edge here, I think, overall, because if nothing else, they have Chrono Trigger in 95.
Chrono Trigger. Another just...
Come on.
Square beauty right
Yes.
here. Well, this is actually Square and Enix teaming up before they were the same company.
Yes.
So they make this game, and they get the guy that drew Dragon Ball to do the character designs. And
yes.
When it came out, it was in magazines. They called it the Dream Game.
Dream Game.
Because it was like, what if we combined all these like RPG and Japanese artists all together into one team, and we made a game.
Yeah.
And it was Chrono Trigger. Chrono Trigger was excellent.
Fucking awesome.
Great, like, story, great, like, it's time travel based, and it did really cool stuff with the characters where, you leave them in one time period, you come back, and it just a classic. If you've ever played it,
It's great.
If you haven't, there's modern versions to, like, they haven't updated the graphics or anything, but you can play it to this day. It's great. It's just a great game.
One of the best NES Super Nintendo soundtracks of all time.
Oh, absolutely.
Of all time.
Absolutely.
Literally.
Yeah.
So Super Nintendo had the advantage here on the fighting games with Killer Instinct, and I say that because Genesis didn't get Killer Instinct.
Well, it was Nintendo and Rare again.
Exactly. Killer Instinct was very anticipated, very popular. I don't know that I love it.
It's revolutionary for fighting games only in the fact that it's the first fighting game that truly embraced combos. It didn't it wasn't like an add-on. Like Street Fighter combos were kind of an accident.
Yes, they were.
Like, they were like the system not going fast enough or some shit.
That's all it was.
But like Killer Instinct was like, what if we just made the whole game about combos?
Yeah.
And
it's popular.
A lot of people clung to that because there's fighting games to this day centered around combos,
based,
like the Marvel vs. Capcom games or something like that. So it's like, I feel like Killer Instinct was a huge influence in that sense.
I mean, plus there was TJ Combo.
Yeah, there's literally a guy named Combo.
That's not a name.
Yeah.
Now, this was on both, but Genesis had it also. Primal Rage.
Yes.
The one where you turn into animal, or like you are animals and you yell about it.
But it had the same kind of, the scanned-in fake 3D thing
looking,
like Killer Instinct.
Just wanted to mention it.
It's funny, Killer Instinct and those are like the same graphical stuff, but Primal Rage looks like dog shit.
It looks like shit. Even on Super Nintendo, it's not very good. Donkey Kong Country 2, the sequel, came out in 95.
This was going to sell a lot no matter fucking what.
No matter fucking what.
Because holy shit.
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
1 year after the other one. It's like, holy crap.
Donkey Kong's not even in it. Diddy and
You're
Dixie.
saving him, but the cool thing about that is I liked Diddy Kong better in the first one, and I was like, ooh, like this.
Oh, you were?
Because he was
I was
faster.
a Donkey Kong guy.
Because he was faster.
Well, it's not all about speed.
I liked to go fast in the stages. So
Fast processing.
I'd always tag out Donkey and go with Diddy. So I was I was fucking ready for Donkey Kong Country 2. I was like, this is going to be great.
And it was. Great game. Road Rash 3, Sega was still kicking.
There's one, yeah.
And they're all good. I love the Road Rash
series. And more improvement on the Road Rash formula.
I love them
right?
all. But I think the biggest game of 1995 in the 16-bit market, Sega had a lot of sports games still. That was like still one of their big bread and butters. But the biggest one in the 16-bit market had to be, Quinn, unless I'm completely missing something, Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island.
So, yes and no. It was definitely anticipated, but there was a lot of people turned off by two things. Was the art style, which I think is gorgeous. I can't even believe a Super Nintendo game looks like that.
They backtracked on the Mario World style and went for a hand-drawn kind of...
What people didn't realize at the time is it made the game ageless. It's a
beautiful looking game.
It still looks good.
And it's unique.
It's unique.
It isn't just
fun.
Mario World with a new skin or something.
No, it's
totally
now Yoshi's the character and you can throw the eggs and do all this shit. But the other thing is people always had a problem with the baby.
I mean, he is annoying. To be fair, it's fucking annoying.
But I thought it was, in a weird way, it was a fun gameplay element because it went the Sonic route where you don't die when you get hit. You have to get the baby.
It's like losing the rings, yeah.
It's like losing the rings. So it's like, it's kind of a twist on it. And I thought that game was great.
Great game. Awesome
one of the all-time greats on Super Nintendo.
And a big classic for Super Nintendo, yeah. By 1995, Sega's in debt for various reasons that we don't need to get into, but Nintendo is not, which does give them an advantage in a lot of ways. And Sega was working in 94 and 95 to release its first 32-bit console and the 32X add-on in November of 94. So the Sega CD was a previous add-on, which didn't do anything to really accentuate the Genesis other than have
Sonic CD.
Yeah, I know, but have some better sound quality.
Yeah.
But they didn't take advantage of the graphics at all.
The biggest thing they did was they were like, we can put videos on the screen. And that...
Yeah, but they're all horrible.
Right, but...
No one wants to play them.
The problem is that...
Nighthawk, or what's the one that comes in where the guy says dog meat a real lot?
Night Trap?
No, not Night Trap. The other one, like Dogfish.
Sewer Shark?
Yes.
Yeah.
Dogfish.
Shit Shark.
Yeah, Shit Shark.
Call sign. Dog meat.
The whole marketing campaign behind that is, well, they can put screenshots of real videos, so then they're like, look at the graphics. It's it's literally real.
But it sucked.
Yeah, it's garbage.
And 32X was another appendage for Sega Genesis that... It was basically this fucking thing that you stuck into the Genesis slot, and then you bought a separate game that was only for 32X, and it did act as a pass-through, so you could play your Genesis through it. But they had these alleged 32, and they were, I guess, 32-bit. Were they 32-bit, Quinn? Do you know the tech end of that? I don't have it on me.
It was a 32-bit processor, but I think it was hamstrung by the fact that it still needed the Genesis to operate. So it's basically like latching on a separate... What was in that mushroom was a separate board.
Yeah, but it was still using.
Yeah, but it was passing through it's just a fucking nightmare. The games weren't that amazing. And then on top of it, they had weird 32X and you need the Sega CD also for some fucking reason.
Horrible.
Just
stop.
No, like this, to me, that's like what, by 96, by 95 even,
by 95.
they'd fucked it all up. People were like, why do I need all this shit? Why can't I just play the fucking games?
That's the thing, right? So they're like, 32-bit era, and they release this piece of shit. And none of the games look that impressive, to be honest. They really don't.
The sound's good, but...
The sound is good.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, Nintendo's doing Donkey Kong Country, and that's just on their native console.
I know. And funnily enough, Nintendo, they explored the CD concept
with Philips.
Who? Well,
Sony.
Sony at first, and then they gave them the screw.
They gave Sony the screw in 91 or something.
They behind their back without even fucking telling them in person.
This is true.
They said, "Oh, we're going with Philips," and didn't even tell Sony.
That didn't pan out entirely, although Philips did release on their own the Philips CDI,
and we got Zelda CD that was ass, and
Mario learns to wipe his butt or whatever the games are. They're all terrible.
All fucking
Hotel Mario.
So all that shit just failed.
Awful. Not only that, though, but Sega started to fuck things up in their marketing here because they have the 32X, but Genesis isn't as dominant in 95 as it was in 93.
Right.
Everything had dipped. So they then decide, well, we're going to launch our 32-bit console, the Sega Saturn, first in Japan.
Right.
December 94. Now, 32-bit on CD, huge deal. It was originally planned for September 2nd, 1995 in the United States, Saturn Day, September 2nd. But, oops, at CES, May 11th is going to be the release date.
And nobody has any games made. And, like, the retailers don't know that the fucking system exists. And, like
Walmart's like, what are you doing?
Yeah, excuse us?
KB says we're not selling it. How about that?
Some retailers got so mad that they said we're not carrying it.
KB is one of them.
Yeah.
No, we're not doing it.
Because you lied. Like, you told us
idiot.
September, and now you're just dropping this merchandise in our fucking store.
May.
Like, we didn't even make room on the shelves for it, right?
Experience Sega Saturn's monster torque and parallel processing power.
And the price of this was $3.99. Now, at this same show, in a stroke of fucking marketing genius, Sony, who has been developing their own because Nintendo fucked them over,
They're
right?
bitter. And this is, to me, the ultimate irony. Is like, Sony got the fucking screw from Nintendo.
They did.
This actually, believe it or not, the PlayStation add-on, the guy who worked there, like, he wasn't even supposed to be doing that. He went around his superiors or some shit. Sony wanted it to sort of fail.
Yes.
But then when they got the actual, like, screw from Nintendo, all of a sudden the executives at Sony was like, oh, we're going to fucking beat them at their... Fuck them, right? And so they're like, make the PlayStation a console.
And they did. So the 32-bit PlayStation, which you guys know what that is, right? This was designed to be competition to the Sega Saturn.
Right.
Because it's a new generation. Like, yes, of course it's going to be better than Super Nintendo. Everyone knows that.
Duh.
So Saturn...
But it's on CD, which that sucks based on our experiences with TurboGrafx and
But
Sega.
so it's Saturn, so it's a level playing field, right? The best part is that after Saturn... Sega, who has already released this fucking stupid 32X, right? That undersold and was stupid. Not to mention the Nomad, the handheld version of the Genesis, which like shit the bed also. And they're doing like, oh, whoops, May, like tomorrow or whatever it is, right?
Everyone's like, what?
Surprise! Trying to be like good. The guy from Sony walks, and it was $3.99, right? The guy from Sony walks up and he's like, $2.99.
It's a classic moment, and then he just leaves.
Yeah, he just leaves.
He doesn't even like say anything else. Now I know technically they showed some other shit before
they
that,
did.
but the point is they undercut them by $100 because of in their own fucking stupidity. They just like hastily released it.
$2.99.
And the fact that we're mentioning this is to just show you that the 16-bit era was coming to a close, and thus was the war.
Right.
Ultimately, there were some more games released, and I just want to run down a few games from 96 and 7. So, in 96, Nintendo came up with Super Mario RPG, their own venture with Square.
Great. I mean...
Great RPG.
A great game. Again, it's just... Square was like right on the fucking money during this time period, and everybody wanted to team with them. Other RPG makers, Dragon Ball guy, Nintendo, like everyone's like, we want to work with Square, and so even Nintendo's like, what if we tag with them and make a game?
Well, a brilliant move on Nintendo's part because it introduces people familiar with the side-scrolling Mario games to an RPG. That's what it was.
Ironically, this would be one of the last projects that Square would work on with Nintendo
before
to be continued.
Hopping over somewhere else.
Yeah.
Sega was still doing great with sports. They had NBA Hang Time, which was kind of the spiritual successor to Jam. Good stuff,
good
Midway.
Stuff.
Donkey Kong Country 3.
Not my favorite.
Me neither.
But it was more Donkey Kong Country. It sold well.
Milk the cash cow.
Yeah, milk the cash cow, right?
Madden 97, still kicking, man.
Yeah.
On Genesis. Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 came out for both consoles.
Now, this was actually cool.
This was what it was supposed to be before they rushed 3 out.
You could be like versions of the characters from the old games and stuff.
Classic Smoke and stuff like that.
Like fucking everyone was in this game.
Yeah. The 32-bit equivalent was Mortal Kombat Trilogy.
Right, yeah.
On PlayStation and Saturn.
Now, I see we have two oddballs here at the end. These are games that like nobody fucking bought, but they were...
They pushed the fucking limit of their consoles.
Right.
I want to start with Genesis. Without the aid of 32X, although it was on 32X also, Sega decided, let's somehow cram Virtua Fighter 2 into the Genesis.
So it's not really Virtua Fighter.
It isn't.
It's just like a 2D version of
Correct.
it. Which, on its face, you know, if you don't have a Saturn, maybe you're like, man, I really want to play Virtua Fighter.
Still got the name value.
But it's not really Virtua Fighter.
Correct.
It's just, it's got the characters of Virtua Fighter just in a 2D fighting
fighter.
game. Yeah.
But Super Nintendo did one up here, in my opinion.
This game is insane. Like
they used every expansion chip and extra thing.
Capcom specifically.
That they had to do this to release a home console 16-bit version of Street Fighter fucking Alpha 2.
So this is here, right?
It's all slow.
So this is to me the craziest shit about this.
Go ahead.
Now, visually, It's kind of impressive
Beautiful,
for
yeah.
fucking Super Nintendo.
It's not bad.
It kind of just looks like every other version of Street Fighter Alpha 2, right? Which is incredible, right?
Yes.
But what's the cost of that? There's literally loading
on Super Nintendo
for every round.
It's true though, Quinn.
Pushing so much shit into this thing.
It's insane.
Like it's like overflowing the RAM. So they literally have to like flush it and then load the entire stage over again every round.
That's what it is,
like,
right?
It's insane.
That's what it is. But we just needed to make mention of that. So as 1996 obviously rolls on, Nintendo was working on and then launched their 64-bit system.
Right.
They bypassed the 32-bit completely. Now, we'll probably have something on this later, but obviously the Nintendo 64 came out. PlayStation had been out. And they were competitors despite being different bits. I mean, it's still the same generation. In 1997, two things happened here for both consoles. The final United States Nintendo-developed Super Nintendo game was released, which was Kirby's Dream Land 3. That's November of 97. Now, I want to say that because Frogger came out by Majesco or somebody. I forget who.
I remember seeing that,
in the fall of 98. And
don't
then,
forget the weird like Japanese shit in like 2000, like Metal Slayer
Glory Director's Cut. In the spring of 2000.
That was so wild to me that they were still making Super Nintendo games in 2000.
But as far as like, in-house stuff, 97, the end of 97, 98 is kind of the end. Super Nintendo was discontinued in 99. In Sega Genesis world, the final U.S. game here was NHL 98, released in October of 97.
I had that on PlayStation 1.
There you go.
So that just shows you kind of
the crossing of the generations. Yeah. October 97, they made it that long, and it was actually discontinued, I believe, that same year, 1997, the Genesis. The war was well over by then, and ultimately, in terms of hard numbers, the Sega Genesis sold 18 million units in North America, 30 million worldwide.
Okay.
But despite its 2-year head start in Japan and North America, the Super Nintendo sold 20 million in North America.
Wow.
2 million more. And 49 million worldwide. 19 million more worldwide. Wow. The competition was hot and heavy from 91 to like 93, 94.
Yeah, up to 94 seems to be when it was like really big. And then Sega wanted to go to the 32-bit.
Yeah, which more power to them. The war was over. They had proved to be a worthy competitor to Nintendo.
They sold enough to make a dent, and they made Nintendo
adapt.
They made them adapt, but they also made them not complacent, and I think that made the games better.
Competition, right? It breeds success in a lot of ways. It breeds a great fan experience, if nothing else. We're not here to say which is better. We give you hard numbers, technical and sales. But they mean what they mean because, in my opinion, Quinn, you could take the technology, you could take what's sold more, but it still comes down to preference versus experience. Like, okay, the Whopper versus the Big Mac. Do you care which one sells more?
No.
Do you care which one has which ingredients?
I care which one tastes the best, Joe.
Exactly. And you know what? Maybe you are a person that thinks the Genesis tasted better and had better games, or Super Nintendo, or maybe you're just allowed to like both of them.
Yeah, maybe.
Which I do.
I like both, to be quite
both.
honest with you. It's a rare condition with this
day and age.
This day and age that I can say I actually like both of these consoles.
I really do too.
Yeah.
I think there is an age delineation. If you were, I'm spitballing, between 12 and 20 when the Genesis came out, it was marketed to you.
Oh yeah, it was aimed.
Right. If you're between 5 and 11, like we were when Super Nintendo and Genesis were both out, you might find Super Nintendo better.
Right.
Either way, though, I think it just means you're more susceptible to the targeted marketing.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean one's better than the other.
But they were both ultimately pretty well-rounded.
They were.
Yeah, I mean, like, Sega did have kids' games in Sonic the Hedgehog and stuff like that.
It did.
Yeah.
I would say the Sega strengths were in arcade-style games, beat-em-ups, shoot-em-ups, fighting games, and sports games.
Yes, sports. That was a huge one.
Super Nintendo excelled in the action-adventure, the platformers, and the RPGs.
Yeah, they killed it with the RPGs.
They did. And they both did overall well in everything.
Not that Sega didn't have their own like Phantasy Star and stuff, but I mean, it was Super Nintendo's domain, the RPGs.
They had Earthbound, Quinn.
Yeah.
But one way or another, folks, the 16-bit war was almost the decade. I mean, 91 to 97.
Right.
pretty long where both of these consoles were both out at the same time. It was great if you were a kid at the time and you had access to one or the other or both because the games were so good.
It was a great time to play video games.
It was a great time to play video games. So we want to hear about your great times playing video games. We want to hear about which console you prefer, or maybe both, or maybe you're one of those TurboGrafx people.
Yeah.
Let us know.
Imagine that's your entire 16-bit era system.
Well, nothing wrong with bonk. One way or another, why don't you bonk on over to us on Twitter at AWM Podcast. You can also join our group, Acid Washed Memories, on Facebook. And hey, be sure to leave us a review. Alyssa's going to remind you also, so make sure you do it. One way or another, we will, of course, be back next week for something completely different. Until that time, my name is Joe Murata. That gentleman is Michael Quinn, and we will see you next week.
See ya.
Like what you heard? Be sure to leave a review and subscribe on your favorite podcast app. We will see you next week.